The void between stars was not silent. Commander Tailvek had learned that truth early in his career, long before the Unity had entrusted him with a fleet, long before his name had been spoken in the same breath as the great explorers of Velthari history. Sound did not travel in vacuum. Every child in every creche on every Velthari world knew that, but a ship was never truly silent. The fusion drive hummed at frequencies so low they were felt more than heard, vibrating through the deck plates and up through the soles of his feet in a rhythm that matched his own twin-chambered heartbeat. The life support systems whispered through thousands of kilometers of conduits, moving air and water and warmth through the vessel's veins with the quiet persistence of a living thing. The instruments chattered constantly, passive sensors sweeping the electromagnetic spectrum, navigation arrays updating position fixes against distant pulsars, communication relays monitoring hundreds of frequencies for the faintest whisper of intelligent transmission. It was the silence between those sounds that unsettled him, the gaps, the pauses where nothing happened and nothing moved and the universe simply existed, vast and indifferent and utterly unconcerned with the tiny speck of organized matter that was his ship crawling through it. He had never admitted that to anyone. A commander of the Velthari Unity who confessed to being unsettled by empty space would find himself reassigned to orbital customs inspection within a cycle. But here, alone on the bridge during the night watch with only a skeleton crew and the humming dark, he could acknowledge it. The void was not silent, but it wanted to be. He stood at the observation port, a slab of transparent crystalline composite 2 meters wide and 3 tall, the largest viewport on the Resolute Judgment and one of the largest ever installed on a Velthari military vessel. Most commanders preferred tactical displays to raw visual observation. Tailvik had never understood that preference. A tactical display was interpretation, filtered, processed, reduced to icons and vectors and probability curves. Looking through a viewport was participation. You saw what was actually there, not what the ship's computers thought was there. And right now, what was actually there was nothing. Nothing at all. They were 17 days beyond the last Unity navigational buoy. 17 days into territory that no Velthari vessel had officially entered in over 2 centuries. The star charts here were based on long-range telescopic surveys compiled by automated probes, and even those were decades old, their resolution degrading with every light-year of distance. The stars ahead were catalogued, designated by alphanumeric strings that conveyed no meaning, no poetry, no sense of wonder. Just data. Just points of light that some algorithm had measured and categorized and filed away, without ever once stopping to appreciate the fact that each one of them was a furnace of nuclear fury burning with the combined energy of worlds. Tailvik pressed his forehead against the cool surface of the viewport and exhaled slowly, watching the faint mist of his breath condense and dissipate on the inside of the crystalline composite. His reflection stared back at him, pale violet skin drawn tight over angular cheekbones, 2 large eyes with vertical slit pupils that reflected the bridge lighting as twin amber points, a narrow jaw that ended in the slight forward projection that less charitable species described as a snout. His head crest, the bony, serrated ridge that ran from his brow to the base of his skull, was raised to its full extension, the Velthari indicator of alertness and focused attention. It had been raised for 17 days. He was tired. Behind him, the bridge stretched in a gentle arc, its surfaces covered in the soft bioluminescent panels that served as both lighting and interface for Velthari technology. The design philosophy was organic, flowing, every surface curved and contoured in ways that echoed the natural architecture of their homeworld's great coral forests. Consoles grew from the deck like polyps, their surfaces responsive to touch and to the subtle bioelectric field that every Velthari generated. There were no chairs. Velthari had evolved as standing creatures. Their powerful digitigrade legs could maintain a stationary posture for cycles without fatigue, and the bridge reflected that biology. Officers stood at their stations like herons in a marsh, motionless for long minutes before shifting with sudden precision to adjust a sensor array or acknowledge a data update. Tonight, though night was a fiction in space, maintained only by the ship's circadian lighting cycle, there were only 7 officers on the bridge instead of the full complement of 32. Sub-Lieutenant Vesara at Communications, her young crest still slightly flexible with the plasticity of youth. Lieutenant Orek at Navigation, a stocky male whose blunt, practical demeanor had earned him the quiet admiration of the entire crew. 2 sensor technicians whose names Tailvik had not yet learned, new transfers, replacements for the 3 crew members who had requested reassignment before the mission departed. A medical officer who was technically supposed to be in the sickbay but who had developed the habit of drifting onto the bridge during the night watch, claiming the ambient frequency of the bridge systems helped her focus on her research. And Chief Engineer Gareth, ancient and irreplaceable, who had served on more deep-range missions than the rest of the crew combined, and who slept standing up at his station with his crest flat against his skull in a way that never failed to make Tailvik think of a dead thing. They were a thin crew for a thin moment, and they all knew it. You should rest, Commander. The voice came from his left Vesara without looking up from her station. Her fingers moved across the communication console in patterns that Tailvek recognized as automated frequency sweeps, the kind of routine maintenance task that kept hands busy while minds wandered. She was good at that. Good at appearing occupied while actually paying attention to everything happening around her. It was a survival skill she had learned young, he suspected. She had grown up on the frontier, Veltara Station, the outermost Unity outpost before the Veil Barrier. Children raised on the frontier learned early that appearing unaware was the best way to stay alive. I rested 4 hours ago, he replied, not moving from the viewport. That was 11 hours ago, sir. He turned his head just enough to look at her. She was not looking at him, her eyes were fixed on her console, her crest held at a moderate height that conveyed polite deference without submission. But the corner of her mouth, what humans would have called a mouth, though the anatomical structures were entirely different, twitched almost imperceptibly. She knew he had been standing at this viewport for nearly half a cycle. She also knew that telling him directly to stop would be insubordination, so she was doing the Velthari equivalent, stating an obvious fact and trusting him to connect the implication. You're very precise about time, Sub-Lieutenant. It's my profession, sir. He almost smiled, almost. Instead, he turned back to the viewport and the nothing beyond it. What are you finding on the sweeps? Nothing, sir, which is itself notable. She paused, and he heard her fingers stop moving. We are well beyond the range of any known Unity transmission source. We should be picking up background noise, stellar wind interference, magnetospheric emissions from any nearby gas giants, the residual radio hum of the galactic plane, and all of that is present and within expected parameters. Another pause, longer this time, but there is an absence where other things should be. Tailvek felt the muscles along his spine tighten. Explain. I cannot detect any artificial electromagnetic emissions, Commander, none from any source in any direction. She finally looked up and her crest had risen slightly, not to full alert, but enough to indicate that her professional attention had been fully engaged. We are in a region of space that is, to the best of my knowledge, completely devoid of intelligent technological activity. No navigation beacons, no communication relays, not even the ghost signatures of deactivated systems. Either nothing has ever been here, or everything that was here has been very thoroughly removed. The words hung in the recycled air of the bridge. Tailvek did not respond immediately. He did not need to. Every officer within earshot understood the implication because every one of them had studied the mission brief, had read the same fragmented archives, had sat through the same interminable briefings about what they might or might not find beyond the veil. The veil barrier, the quarantine zone, the exclusion. It had a dozen names in a dozen languages, all of them referring to the same thing, a vast region of space roughly spherical, approximately 400 light-years in diameter, centered on a yellow dwarf star that appeared on no modern star chart but that appeared very prominently in the oldest databases ever recovered from precursor ruins. Sol, the human homeworld. The heart of a quarantine that had been established by what the Velthari called the builders and what the fragmentary human records called the architects, sometime in the distant past, before the Velthari had achieved spaceflight, before the Unity had been founded, before recorded history itself. No one knew exactly when the quarantine had been established. The builder ruins were old, unimaginably old, their dating systems so degraded that the best estimates placed their active civilization somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 years in the past. But the quarantine was newer than the ruins. That much was clear from the physical evidence. The barrier itself was not a wall or a shield or a physical structure of any kind. It was a region, a zone of space within which certain types of faster-than-light travel became unstable. Velthari slip drives, which operated by folding local spacetime along gravitational contours, functioned perfectly outside the barrier. Inside it, the folds became erratic, unpredictable. Ships that entered the veil either emerged at their destination safely or were flung into random jump trajectories, sometimes hundreds of light-years off course. The effect was not consistent. It could not be predicted, and it could not be compensated for with any known technology. It was, in the dry language of the Unity's Science Directorate, an anomalous spacetime distortion of unknown origin and mechanism. In the language of every deep-range captain who had ever encountered it, it was the wall that says go back. And now Tailvek was beyond it. The Resolute Judgment and its 11 companion vessels had crossed the Veil Barrier 17 days ago using a technique that the Unity's most brilliant slip drive engineers had developed over the course of 6 frantic months of research. It was not a solution. It was a brute force workaround. By plotting a jump trajectory that grazed the barrier's edge at a shallow angle and then applying maximum drive power at the exact moment of transition, they could push through the instability zone before it had time to fully manifest. The maneuver was dangerous. The calculations had to be precise to within 1 part in 4 billion. And it only worked because the barrier, for reasons no one understood, was slightly thinner along the vector they had chosen, the approach path from Veltara Station, which was itself the closest Unity outpost to the quarantine zone and had been built. Tailvek now suspected, precisely because someone in the distant past had identified this route as the most viable point of entry. All 12 ships had made it through. That, more than anything, had convinced Tailvek that the barrier was not designed to be impassable. It was designed to be discouraging, a filter, not a wall, intended to prevent casual intrusion while still permitting, for whatever reason, a determined entry. The question that had haunted him since the moment of transit was deceptively simple: who had needed to pass through, and why? Commander, Orek's voice from the navigation station, deep and unhurried, the voice of a male who had spent 20 years plotting courses through regions where a single miscalculation meant death. We are approaching the probe's last reported position. Estimated arrival in 47 minutes. Tailvek nodded without turning. Sensor status. Long-range arrays at maximum gain, one of the sensor technicians replied, a thin female named Ketha, her crest marked with the distinctive scarring of a plasma conduit accident that spoke to a past in the engineering section before her transfer. I am detecting stellar bodies consistent with the probe's survey data. A G-type main sequence star at bearing 047, estimated distance 8 light-years. 2 gas giants in wide orbits. A debris belt that may be the remains of a terrestrial planet, hard to tell at this range. No energy signatures, no drive emissions, nothing artificial. Nothing artificial, Tailvek echoed, just as Vesara had said. The void was clean, empty. Too empty in a way that his instincts, the instincts of a prey species that had evolved to be hyper-aware of absence as much as presence, registered as wrong. He pushed away from the viewport and walked the length of the bridge, his digitigrade feet clicking softly on the organic curves of the deck. He passed Gareth, still sleeping upright, and paused for a moment to look at the old engineer. Gareth's face was a map of age-deep grooves around his eyes, his crest worn down to blunt nubs at the tips. The pale violet of his skin faded to an almost grayish lavender in patches where the pigmentation had simply given up. He had volunteered for this mission. Volunteered. A being with more deep-range experience than anyone alive in the Unity had looked at the mission parameters and raised his hand. When Tailvek had asked him why, privately, in the quiet of his ready room before departure, Gareth had given an answer that still echoed in his mind. Because I have seen things in the deep void that do not match the archives, Commander, things that the Science Directorate cannot explain and does not want to discuss, things that suggest the void is not as empty as we pretend it is. He had paused, his ancient eyes fixing Tailvek with a look that carried the weight of decades of unspoken knowledge. And because if even a fraction of the old stories about humans is true, then I want to see them with my own eyes before I die. Not through a probe's corrupted data feed, not through a scholar's interpretation of fragmentary texts, with my eyes. Tailvek had not told Gareth that his own reasons were not so different. He reached the tactical station, the largest console on the bridge, a broad curved surface that could display a three-dimensional holographic projection of the space surrounding the fleet. It was currently dark, showing only the 12 blue icons of the Unity vessels moving in tight formation through the void. He activated it with a touch, and the display bloomed to life around him, a sphere of light and data that made him feel, as it always did, like a god looking down at a very small creation. Scale to maximum, he said quietly. The display shifted. The 12 icons shrank to almost nothing as the perspective pulled outward, until they were a single cluster of points near the center of a vast sphere that represented the sensor range of the combined fleet. Beyond that sphere, darkness. Not rendered darkness, not the black of a screen with no input, but the represented darkness of space that had not been scanned, could not be scanned, existed only as a theoretical absence on the edge of the display. It was the nothing that bothered him, the absolute, uncompromising nothing of a region that should have contained something. Even in the most remote reaches of known space, there were traces. Ancient navigation beacons from extinct civilizations, long since powered down but still detectable by their material composition. The faint gravitational ripples of mass that had been moved and arranged by intelligent hands. The chemical signatures of atmospheric modification, terraforming attempts that had succeeded or failed, and left their marks on planetary atmospheres detectable across light years. Here within the quarantine zone there was none of that. The worlds they had passed, the gas giants, the debris belt, 3 lifeless rocky bodies that their sensors had catalogued with clinical efficiency, were all pristine, undisturbed, unvisited, as if no one had ever been here. But the probe had detected something. That was the entire reason for this mission. The probe, designated VR-7, launched from Veltara Station 11 cycles ago on a ballistic trajectory that had been calculated to carry it just inside the Veil barrier's edge before its systems failed, had transmitted a single burst of data before going dark. That burst had been received by Veltara Station's Deep Space Antenna Array, relayed to the Unity Capital World, and had spent 6 cycles being analyzed by every relevant scientific institution in Velthari space before anyone with authority was willing to admit what it might mean. The data was corrupted. Most of it was unusable, scrambled by the barrier's effect on the probe's communication systems, reduced to noise and static by the same spacetime instability that made slip drive transit so hazardous. But one reading had come through clearly, one single, unmistakable, impossible reading. A gravitational disturbance consistent with thousands of simultaneous superluminal exits. Someone had crossed the barrier, not one ship, not a dozen, thousands all at once, all from inside the quarantine zone heading outward. The debate that followed had been vicious. The science directorate insisted the reading was an artifact, a resonance pattern created by the barrier itself interacting with the probe's sensors in an unexpected way. The Military Advisory Council was more cautious, pointing out that the gravitational signature was consistent with known slip drive exit profiles and was therefore, by definition, not a natural phenomenon. The Unity Senate, as was its habit, had tried to split the difference, funding a limited reconnaissance mission while simultaneously issuing statements that emphasized the exploratory and scientific nature of the expedition. Tailvik had been selected to command because he had 3 qualities that the Senate considered essential for this particular mission. He was competent, he was discreet, and he was not politically ambitious enough to use whatever they found as a platform for his own advancement. The third quality, he suspected, was the one that had actually gotten him the assignment. The Senate did not want a hero. It wanted a messenger, someone who would go look, and come back with a report that could be filed away, classified, and forgotten. That was not going to happen. He knew it the way he knew the void was not silent, instinctively in his bones, in the deep evolutionary part of his brain that had kept his ancestors alive on a world where everything wanted to eat them. The probe's data was real. The gravitational signature was real. And whatever had caused it was still out there, somewhere in the clean, empty, impossibly empty space beyond the veil. 30 minutes to probe's last position, Orak announced. Tailvik stood in the center of the holographic display, surrounded by the 12 points of light that represented his fleet, and felt the weight of something vast and undefined pressing against the edges of his awareness. It was not a feeling he could name in Velthari. There was no word for it in his language because Velthari psychology had evolved to process threats that were immediate, visible, and physically present. This was none of those things. It was a feeling about the shape of the void, about the way the darkness beyond the sensor horizon seemed to have a texture that darkness should not have. Vesara, he said, open a priority channel to all ships, encrypted code Sigma. Vesara's fingers moved, and he saw her crest rise slightly at the designation. Sigma-level encryption was reserved for communications of the highest sensitivity, the kind that were not merely classified but deniable. If this mission went wrong, Sigma-encrypted messages could be disavowed by the Senate, their existence refused, their contents dismissed as fabrication. Channel open, Commander, all vessels receiving. Tailvik straightened to his full height, his crest rising to its maximum extension, and addressed the fleet. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and measured and carried absolutely no trace of the tension that coiled in his chest like a spring. All ships, this is Commander Tailvik. We are 30 minutes from the probe's last reported position. I am elevating our alert status to Condition 3, all sensor arrays to maximum sensitivity, all weapon systems to standby, all slip drives to pre-charge sequence. This is not an indication of hostile contact. This is a precautionary measure consistent with our mission parameters and the unknown nature of our destination. He paused. I expect every officer on every ship to maintain professional composure. We are the Velthari Unity. We do not fear the unknown, we observe it. Tailvik out. He closed the channel and exhaled slowly through his nostrils, a deliberate breathing technique he had learned from a meditation instructor decades ago, back when he was a junior officer and the future had seemed like something that happened to other people. Condition 3, aye, Commander, Vesara acknowledged, and he could hear the faint tremor beneath her professional composure. Condition 3 meant something specific in the Velthari naval lexicon, potential contact with unknown intelligent capability, posture defensive but non-provocative. It was one step below Condition 2, which was confirmed contact with hostile intent, and 2 steps below Condition 1, which was active engagement. The fleet responded. Through the holographic display, Tailvik watched the 12 icons shift their formation, closing the spacing between ships, angling sensor coverage to provide overlapping fields of view, orienting weapon emplacements toward the most likely threat vector, which in this case was directly ahead toward the probe's last position, toward whatever had made the void feel wrong. 20 minutes, Orak reported. The minutes crawled. Tailvik returned to the viewport but did not press his forehead against it this time. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his crest fully raised, his eyes scanning the stars with a focus that he knew was futile at this distance, but that he could not stop himself from attempting. The stars looked the same as they always did, points of white and yellow and faint blue, scattered across the black with the apparent randomness that astronomers knew was not random at all, but that the eye could never quite resolve into patterns. Except. He frowned, leaned forward slightly. Squinted, though he knew that squinting, a reflex inherited from terrestrial ancestors who needed to focus on distant moving objects, had no effect in space. There was something wrong with the stars. Not wrong in a way he could immediately identify. Not wrong in the way that a bright spot where no star should be would be wrong, or in the way that a star that was moving would be wrong. It was subtler than that. It was a quality of wrongness, a sense that the distribution of light points ahead of him was not quite. Commander, Ketha's voice from the sensor station, and her crest was fully raised, every serrated edge visible, the Velthari body's unequivocal signal of alarm. Commander, I am detecting an anomalous pattern in the forward sensor sweep. It is not registering as discrete objects, it is registering as a texture in the background radiation. Like something is between us and the stars ahead but is not opaque, not solid. More like, she hesitated, and Tailvek had never heard Ketha hesitate before. She was a data analyst. She dealt in certainties. More like a cloud, Commander, a cloud of something that is scattering the starlight. A cloud, Tailvek repeated, of what? I do not know. It does not match any known natural phenomenon. It is not a nebula. It is too localized, too dense. It is not a debris field. The particle sizes are too small and too uniform. It is not. She stopped again, and this time the stop was not hesitation. It was the cognitive equivalent of a system crash, her mind encountering data that did not fit any existing framework and simply refusing to process it. Commander, I do not know what it is. How far? At current sensor resolution, the leading edge is approximately, a pause as she consulted her instruments. 8 light minutes ahead, we will be in direct visual range in approximately 12 minutes. Tailvek turned from the viewport. His hearts were beating faster now, not the slow, synchronized rhythm of calm, but the slightly accelerated, slightly desynchronized pattern that indicated elevated stress response. He was aware of every officer on the bridge watching him, waiting for instructions, waiting for him to be the commander they needed. He was also aware, with a clarity that bordered on painful, that he had no instructions to give. No protocol covered this. No training scenario had prepared him for a sensor officer saying, I do not know what it is, with that particular quality of bewilderment in her voice. All ships to condition 2, he said. Vesara's fingers moved before the words had finished leaving his mouth. He heard the sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind him, one of the new technicians, he thought, and made a mental note to have a word with whoever had assigned raw recruits to a deep-range reconnaissance mission. Condition 2 meant confirmed contact. Not confirmed hostile intent. Tailvek had not said that because he did not have the data to support it, but confirmed contact with something that was not natural, not empty space, not nothing. The fleet's formation tightened further. The holographic display showed the 12 ships clustering into a defensive sphere, weapons now fully active rather than on standby, slip drives humming at pre-charge levels that would allow emergency jumps in under 90 seconds. It was a formation designed for one purpose: to survive the first minutes of an encounter with a superior force while gathering enough data to make informed decisions about fight or flight. 10 minutes, Orek said, and his voice was different now. Deeper, harder, the voice of a navigator who had stopped thinking about routes and started thinking about escape vectors. Tailvek stood at the center of his bridge, his crew around him, his fleet around him, and watched the viewport with an intensity that made his eyes ache. The stars ahead were changing. He could see it now, could see what Ketha's instruments had detected from 8 light minutes away. The points of light were not disappearing. They were dimming, each one losing a fraction of its brightness as if a veil were being drawn across the sky. Not uniformly, the dimming was patchy, inconsistent, as if the obscuring material was distributed in clumps and streamers rather than in an even layer. But the overall effect was unmistakable. Something vast was between the fleet and the distant stars, and it was getting closer. Or they were getting closer to it. Commander, Vesara's voice was very quiet, very controlled, the controlled quiet of someone who was deliberately preventing themselves from screaming. I am receiving a signal. Tailvek turned to source. Forward, broad spectrum. It is not a communication signal in any format I recognize. It is more like a carrier wave. A continuous emission on multiple frequencies simultaneously, with no modulation, no encoding, no discernible information content. It is as if something is transmitting silence on every channel at once. Can you determine the point of origins? Vesara worked her console with fingers that moved so fast they were almost a blur. The signal is coming from directly ahead, from within the, she stopped. Her crest went flat against her skull. Commander, the signal is coming from within the cloud. The bridge was silent, not the operational silence of focused work but the absolute suffocating silence of fear. Tailvek could hear his own heart's beating, could hear the distant hum of the drive. Could hear the tiny, involuntary sounds of Velthari bodies under stress, the rapid breathing of the new technician, the soft click of Ketha's claws against her console, the low, almost subsonic vibration that Gareth produced in his sleep when he was dreaming, which Tailvek had always found unsettling but which now felt almost comforting in its normalcy. 7 minutes, Auroch said. Ketha, Tailvek said, and was pleased that his voice sounded steady. Give me everything you have on that cloud. Composition, density, extent, any pattern you can find. I don't care how speculative it is, I need something. Ketha's response was not verbal. Her console exploded with data, spectrographic analyses, particle density maps, electromagnetic frequency distributions, gravitational field measurements. All of it cascading across the holographic display in overlapping layers that would have been incomprehensible to a non-specialist, but that told Tailvek in broad strokes a story that made his blood run cold. The cloud was not gas, it was not dust. It was not any naturally occurring substance that Ketha's databases could identify. What it was a dispersed field of microscopic particles, each one roughly the size of a large molecule, each one exhibiting an energy signature consistent with, Ketha's analysis flagged this word in red 3 times, the analytical equivalent of shouting, engineered nanomaterial. Someone had created this cloud, deliberately, and they had dispersed it across a volume of space that Ketha's instruments were now struggling to measure because the edges kept extending as the sensors gained resolution, the cloud going on and on and on, layer after layer, deeper and thicker and more extensive than. Commander, Ketha's voice was barely a whisper. The cloud extends beyond my maximum sensor range in all directions except directly behind us. I cannot determine its full extent, but based on the density profile and the rate at which it is thickening as we approach, I estimate that the densest concentration, the center, is at least, she ran the numbers. Tailvek watched her face as the result appeared on her display, and he saw something he had never seen on a Velthari face before. The expression of a mind encountering a scale that it could process mathematically but could not comprehend. How large? Tailvek asked. Based on the gravitational distortion pattern, the densest region of the cloud has a mass consistent with, she swallowed. Consistent with approximately 40,000 individual vessels, Commander. The number hit the bridge like a physical blow. The new technician made a sound, a small, involuntary keening noise that in Velthari body language was the equivalent of a sob. Somewhere behind Tailvek, he heard the medical officer's chair scrape against the deck as she stood up abruptly, her body responding to the surge of stress hormones before her mind could intervene. 40,000, Tailvek said. The words felt foreign in his mouth. Absurd, a fairy tale number. The entire Velthari Unity fleet, every warship, every transport, every patrol vessel, every armed platform in every system numbered approximately 8,000. 40,000 was not a fleet, it was a civilization on the move. That is a minimum estimate based on gravitational signature alone, Ketha continued, her voice finding its professional footing even as her crest remained flat in terror. The actual number could be significantly higher. The nanomaterial cloud is interfering with fine-resolution gravimetric readings. I may be detecting only the largest vessels. 5 minutes, Auroch said. Vesara, Tailvek said, the signal, has it changed? No, sir, still a continuous carrier wave on all frequencies, no modulation, no, she stopped. Tailvek heard her claws click rapidly across her console. Wait, there is a change. A secondary signal is emerging from within the carrier. It is, Commander, it is a directional transmission. Narrow beam, aimed directly at us. The bridge went from silent to frozen. Every officer, every technician, every sleeping engineer, Tailvek felt the attention of the entire ship converge on that single statement like light bending around a gravity well. Aimed at us specifically. Yes, sir, the beam width is narrow enough that it would only be received by a vessel within approximately 500 kilometers of our position. It is not a broadcast. It is a message, to us, to the resolute judgment. Tailvek stood in the eye of his crew's terror and felt something unexpected shift inside him. The fear was still there. He was not insane, he was afraid, deeply and properly afraid in the way that a prey species was supposed to be afraid of the unknown. But layered on top of it, or perhaps beneath it, was something else. Something that his ancestors had carried through millions of years of evolution on a world where they were not the largest, not the strongest, not the fastest, but had survived nonetheless. It was not courage. Courage was a conscious choice, a decision to act despite fear. This was older than choice, older than thought. It was attention, Pure, focused, predatory attention, the faculty that had allowed his prey species ancestors to survive by being more aware, more observant, more present than the creatures that hunted them. Every sense sharpened, every nerve tuned. His crests rose to their absolute maximum, the bony serrations catching the bridge light like a crown of pale violet blades. His eyes dilated, the vertical slits widening to admit maximum light. His heart synchronized into a single powerful rhythm, pumping oxygen-rich blood to every muscle and neuron. He was not going to die here. Not because he had any reason to believe that was true, but because his body had decided, independently of his conscious mind, that the appropriate response to an overwhelming threat was not paralysis but absolute readiness. "Play it," he said. Vesara's fingers moved. The bridge speakers emitted a tone, a single, sustained note that lasted exactly 2 seconds before cutting off, then silence. Then, language. Not Velthari, not any language Tailvek recognized. But the ship's translation matrix was already working, its algorithms sifting through the fragmentary human linguistic data recovered from precursor archives, cross-referencing phonetic patterns, matching syntactic structures, building a real-time translation model from almost nothing. The process took 3.7 seconds, an eternity on a bridge where every heartbeat lasted a year. Then the translation locked in, and the words appeared on every display on the bridge, and Tailvek read them and the universe changed. Unknown vessels, you have crossed into DESIGNATD Sol SPACKEP. Identify yourselves and state intent. This is your only warning. The words were blunt, direct, devoid of ceremony or diplomacy. They were not the words of a species reaching out in wonder at first contact. They were the words of a sentry challenging an intruder in a restricted zone. They were the words of someone who had been expecting this moment and had prepared for it with the cold precision of military protocol. And they were inhumans. The language of legends, the language of myths, the language that no living Velthari had ever heard spoken by a living human, because no living Velthari had ever met a living human, because humans did not exist. They were stories, fabrications, archaeological misinterpretations, the galaxy's most persistent and most thoroughly debunked fairy tale. Except that fairy tales did not build armadas of 40,000 vessels. Fairy tales did not disperse engineered nanomaterial across volumes of space that dwarfed Velthari territory. Fairy tales did not send targeted messages in archaic but recognizable languages to the first fool who came poking through their quarantine line. 2 minutes to visual range, Orek said, and his voice had reached a pitch that Tailvek had never heard from him. The controlled calm of a professional pushed to the absolute limit of his composure. Tailvek stared at the words on the display. They glowed in the soft bioluminescent blue of Velthari interface technology, alien characters rendered in an alien alphabet, but carrying a meaning that was inescapably, undeniably, terrifyingly clear. This is your only warning. Not we welcome you, not please identify yourselves, not let us discuss this. A warning, a single warning, delivered with the confidence of someone who did not need to repeat themselves because the consequences of ignoring it were so obvious that elaboration would be redundant. Commander, Vesara's voice, he turned. She was looking at him with those wide, young eyes, her crest flat, her face pale. They've detected us. They knew we were here before we knew they were there. They have been watching us approach for, she checked her console. For at least the last 47 minutes, possibly longer. They had been watching. The entire time Tailvek had stood at the viewport admiring the emptiness of the void had not been empty. The entire time his fleet had cruised through what they thought was uncharted, unclaimed, unobserved space, something had been observing them, measuring them, assessing them. And that something had decided, calmly, deliberately, with the unhurried patience of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere to run to speak. 1 minute, Orek said. Tailvek turned back to the viewports. The stars ahead were almost gone now, hidden behind a veil of dispersed nanomaterial that turned the sky into a uniform grayish haze, featureless and oppressive like looking into fog. But the fog was not uniform. As he watched, shapes began to emerge dark against the gray, silhouettes that were too angular, too regular, too deliberate to be natural formations. They were far away still at the very edge of visual resolution, but there were so many of them, not dozens, not hundreds. Thousands upon thousands of dark angular shapes, each one trailing a faint blue-white glow that cut through the nanomaterial haze like a blade, each one moving in precise coordination with its neighbors, the entire vast formation shifting and adjusting with the fluid synchronization of a single organism. Ships. Human ships. Tailvek's legs trembled. He locked his knees and forced them still. His crest ached from being held at maximum extension for so long. His eyes burned from staring at a display that his mind was struggling to process because the scale of what he was seeing exceeded anything in his experience, anything in his training, anything in the entire history of Velthari space exploration. The Armada was not merely large, it was incomprehensible. It stretched across the sky from one edge of the viewport to the other, and the viewport was showing only a fraction of the total, and the total was still beyond measurement. And it was not stopping. The Armada continued its advance, steady, unhurried, utterly indifferent to the 12 tiny Velthari vessels that had just appeared on its forward perimeter. The formation did not alter to engage them. The screening elements did not pivot to intercept. The vast defensive spheres did not contract to protect against a potential threat. The Armada simply continued, flowing past and around and beyond the Unity fleet like a river flowing past a stone. And in that moment, Tailvik understood something that was more terrifying than any threat could have been. They were not being threatened. They were being ignored. The Armada had assessed them, had looked at 12 Velthari warships with their Condition 2 alerts and their active weapons and their pre-charged slip drives, and had found them insufficient to warrant even a course correction. They were not a threat, they were not an obstacle, they were not even an annoyance, they were nothing, less than nothing. A footnote in the tactical assessment of whatever operation this Armada was executing, noticed and catalogued and dismissed in the same instant. Tailvik thought of the stories, the fragmentary archives, the quarantine, the precursors who had sealed an entire region of space to contain a species they feared. He thought of the scholars who had spent careers arguing that humans were a myth. He thought of the Senate that had sent him here expecting to file his report and forget it. He thought of Gareth sleeping at his station who had wanted to see with his own eyes. "Open a channel," Tailvik said quietly. The words came from somewhere deep inside him, from a place that was older than fear, older than reason, older than the Velthari species itself. "All frequencies, all ships, let them see us, let them hear us." "Commander," Vesara began, and he could hear the protest in her voice. The reasonable, rational, survival-oriented protest of an officer who knew that announcing your presence to a force that could annihilate you without noticing was a very specific kind of suicide. "Do it, Sub-Lieutenant." A pause, then Vesara's fingers moved and the channel opened, and Tailvik stood at the center of his bridge with an armada of legends filling his viewport and spoke into the void with a voice that did not shake because his body had decided, somewhere in the depths of its evolutionary programming, that this was the moment it had been built for. "This is Commander Tailvik of the Velthari Unity reconnaissance vessel Resolute Judgment, commanding a fleet of 12 Unity warships. We have crossed the Veil barrier in response to anomalous sensor data. We come in peace. We come with questions." He paused, and in the pause he felt the weight of every story, every fragment, every whisper about the species that the precursors had feared enough to quarantine an entire region of space. "And we come because the galaxy told us you were a legend, and legends do not build armadas." He closed the channel. The void received his words and swallowed them, and for a long, terrible, eternal moment there was no response. The Armada flowed onwards. The stars stayed hidden. And then, the display flickered. The display flickered. It was not a malfunction. Tailvik had served on starships long enough to know the difference between a system's failure and an external intrusion, between the stuttering, erratic flicker of a power fluctuation and the clean, deliberate, precisely timed pulse of a signal overriding your display protocols. This was the latter. This was someone reaching through the Resolute Judgment's defensive electronic architecture, the way a hand reaches through water, smoothly, confidently, without resistance, because the water does not know it is being touched until the fingers close around it. The bridge went dark, not fully dark. The emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing every curved surface in a dim red that made the organic contours of the walls look like the inside of some vast living throat. But every active display, every holographic projection, every data interface across the entire bridge went simultaneously blank. For 2 heartbeats there was nothing, just the red light and the hum of the drive and the sound of 22 Velthari breathing in startled unison. Then the main display reactivated, and Tailvik forgot how to breathe. A face stared out at him from the screen. Not a Velthari face, not a Thraxis face, not a Keithrani face, not any of the 47 sentient species whose physiologies were catalogued in the Unity's xenobiological databases. This was something he had seen only in reconstruction, in the crude artistic renderings compiled by archaeologists from fragmentary textual descriptions recovered from builder ruins. Images that had always been accompanied by scholarly caveats about reliability and artistic interpretation, and the fundamental impossibility of accurately reconstructing an alien appearance from second-hand, accounts written in a language you didn't fully understand. The reconstructions had been wrong. Not in their broad strokes. The bipedal stance was correct. The 2 arms, the single head, the general arrangement of features all matched the archaeological consensus. But the reconstructions had failed to convey something that no textual description could capture, something that existed not in the structure of the face but in the quality of its presence. The face on the screen had an intensity to it that made Tailvec's hindbrain, that ancient, unevolved, prey species part of his mind that had not changed in 100 million years, scream a single word at him in a voice older than language. Predator. It was not the eyes, though the eyes were part of it. Two of them set in the front of the face rather than on the sides, the configuration of a hunter rather than a watched creature, and they were a brown so dark they were nearly black, and they were focused with a concentration that felt like a physical weight pressing against Tailvec's skull. It was not the face's flatness, the lack of a muzzle, the absence of any projecting jaw structure, the way the mouth was a simple horizontal line that seemed far too small for the face that contained it, which created an unsettling impression of incomplete development, as though the creature had stopped growing halfway to its final form. It was not the hair, the short, cropped growth on top of the skull that served no apparent biological function, and that the archaeological texts had mentioned but that no rendering had adequately conveyed the strangeness of. It was all of it. It was the totality of it. The sense, looking at that face, of encountering a creature that had followed a completely different evolutionary path and had arrived at a completely different solution to the problem of being alive, and that the solution it had arrived at was one that did not include running away. The human was wearing a dark uniform, black or very dark blue, Tailvec could not tell in the display lighting, with markings on the shoulders that were probably rank insignia, but that meant nothing to him. Behind the human, visible in the margins of the display, was the bridge of a warship. It was cramped, claustrophobic. Every surface was flat and angular, covered in screens and manual controls. Physical switches and buttons and levers that suggested a species that did not trust its machines to operate without direct human intervention, that needed to touch its technology, that insisted on maintaining a connection between flesh and mechanism that the Velthari had long since abstracted into bioelectric interface fields. The lighting was harsh and white, without the soft, organic glow of Velthari design, and it cast sharp shadows that made the bridge look like the interior of a weapon. Which Tailvec supposed it was. The human spoke. The sound that came from the bridge speakers was not what Tailvec had expected. The fragmentary human linguistic recordings recovered from builder archives were distorted, degraded by time, corrupted by the same erosion that had destroyed most of the data in those ancient databases. What remained were ghostly impressions of a language, hard consonants, alternating rhythms, a tendency toward rising pitch at the ends of phrases that some scholars interpreted as a question form and others dismissed as regional variation. The sound that now filled the bridge bore only a passing resemblance to those fragments. It was clearer impossibly, almost offensively clearer, as though the language had been preserved in its entirety while every record of it in the rest of the galaxy had been deliberately allowed to decay. The consonants were harder than the reconstructions suggested. The rhythms were more complex, and there was a quality to the voice itself, a depth, a resonance, a weight, that made the archaeological recordings sound like the mumbling of children. The translation matrix engaged. It had been preloaded with every scrap of human linguistic data the Unity possessed, which was to say almost nothing, and Tailvec watched the processing indicator spin for what felt like an eternity before the algorithm locked onto the structure of the speech and began producing real-time translations. The first few words came through fragmented, garbled, half-guessed. I am Admiral James Chen, United Earth Naval Command, 2nd Expeditionary Armada. Then the matrix found its footing, and the rest flowed clearly. You're a long way from Velthari space, Commander. What brings you across the veil? Tailvec's internal temperature spiked. He could feel the heat rising beneath his skin, a physiological stress response, uncontrolled, involuntary, the Velthari body's way of preparing for fight or flight by flooding the bloodstream with thermal energy that would allow muscles to contract at maximum speed. His crest, which had been at full extension for 17 days, went higher, beyond full extension, into the range that the medical texts called hypercrestive response, and that was associated with extreme emotional arousal. He could not have lowered it if he had tried. It was beyond voluntary control. They knew what he was, they knew his species, they had named his space. The implications cascaded through his mind like rocks falling into still water, each one generating ripples that intersected and amplified and collided with the others in patterns that his conscious thought could not track. They knew he was Velthari. They knew where Velthari space was. They had been monitoring Velthari territory closely enough to recognize a Unity military vessel on site. Or more likely, they had been monitoring him specifically, had been tracking his fleet since the moment it crossed the barrier, had perhaps been watching the Velthari species for long enough that a single reconnaissance vessel entering the quarantine zone did not even register as surprising. How long had they been watching? How much did they know? How do you know who we are? He asked, and hated the tremor in his voice, hated it with a passion that burned hotter than the thermal spike in his blood. Because a commander did not tremble, a commander did not show weakness, a commander faced the unknown with the same stoic calm that his ancestors had faced the open ocean. And here he was, the representative of the Velthari unity, shaking like a cresheling in a thunderstorm. The human Chen tilted his head slightly. It was such a small gesture, a barely perceptible movement, a few degrees of rotation around the vertical axis of the neck. The Velthari had a similar gesture, a slight turning of the head that indicated curiosity or reassessment, and Tailvec's translation protocols automatically flagged the human movement as a likely behavioral parallel. But the feeling of the gesture was wrong. When a Velthari tilted its head, it was a soft movement, an invitation, a signal of openness. When Chen tilted his head, it felt like a targeting lock acquiring, not aggressive, not hostile, just assessing. As if he were looking at Tailvec the way a craftsman looks at a tool, trying to determine whether it is suited to the task at hand. We've been watching your species for about 400 years, Chen said casually, as though discussing weather patterns. Long-range passive observation. You expanded into this region roughly 6 centuries after we went quiet. We were curious whether the quarantine would hold. Tailvec's mind stalled. 400 years. 400 years. The Velthari Unity had achieved interstellar flight approximately 800 years ago. Their expansion into the region near the Veil Barrier had begun roughly 2 centuries after that, 600 years ago, by Chen's reckoning, which matched the historical record with a precision that suggested the humans' knowledge of Velthari history was not general but detailed. For 400 of those 600 years, while the Velthari had been building stations and charting stars and arguing about the nature of the barrier in their Senate chambers, humans had been watching. Sitting on the other side of the veil, in their sealed-off quarantine zone, observing every move the Velthari made with instruments advanced enough to gather intelligence across 400 light-years of intervening space without being detected. That was not surveillance. That was dominance. The kind of dominance that came from a technology gap so vast that the observing party did not even need to worry about being noticed because the observed party's sensors were too primitive to detect the observation. Long-range passive observation, Tailvec repeated, hearing the words come out of his mouth as if someone else were speaking them. Across the Veil Barrier. Cross it, through it, around it. The barrier is a sophisticated piece of builder technology, Commander, but it's not perfect. We've had a long time to study it. Chen paused, and something shifted in his expression, a subtle tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible change in the set of his jaw that the translation matrix flagged with a cultural note, indication of controlled amusement. To be honest, it's not even the most impressive piece of builder tech we've found. It's the most annoying, I'll give it that. But impressive, we've decoded its operating principles. We could dismantle it if we wanted to. We haven't, because it turns out that a quarantine zone that nobody else can easily enter is quite useful when you're trying to develop in peace. Tailvec stared at the face on the display. The human's expression had settled back into that unreadable flatness, not aggressive, not friendly, not anything, just present, the way a cliff face is present, the way a storm is present. Existing, occupying space, exerting influence without any apparent effort, and completely indifferent to the effect it has on anything smaller than itself. Behind Tailvec, he could hear the bridge crew breathing, could hear the rapid, shallow respiration of the new technicians, the slightly deeper rhythm of Vesara fighting for control, the slow, steady pulse of Dr. Thessa, who seemed to have achieved some kind of medical trance state that Tailvec made a mental note to ask her about later, assuming there was a later. Garath was still snoring. The old engineer had slept through the most significant event in Velthari history, and Tailvec found that he did not know whether to be annoyed or envious. The quarantine, Tailvec said, forcing his voice to find its professional footing, forcing his crest to lower at least slightly from its hypercrestive peak, forcing every muscle in his body to obey the commands that his mind was issuing with the desperate authority of a captain trying to keep his ship afloat in a hurricane. You're saying the quarantine was not built by the builders to contain you. Set up by the builders, same precursors your archaeologists keep digging up. Different name in our records, architects, but same species, same civilization, same technology base. Chen's voice carried no contempt, no impatience, no emotion at all beyond a flat certainty that was somehow worse than any display of hostility could have been. They were afraid of us, Commander, not because we were dangerous to them. We were barely spacefaring when they found us. Hadn't even colonized our own moon yet. They were afraid of what we would become, so they locked us in, sealed off Sol, wiped us from every database they could access. Tailvec's mind was reeling. The words were clear, crystal clear, the translation matrix performing at a level that should not have been possible given the paucity of reference data, which itself was a detail that Tailvec filed away for later examination because it suggested that the human's transmission included embedded linguistic metadata that was helping the translation algorithms. which meant the humans knew enough about Velthari information technology to interface with it in real time, which meant he stopped the cascade, forced it to stop. There would be time for implications later. For now, he needed to understand the narrative, the story, because Chen was telling him a story, the kind of story that, if true, rewrote the history of the galaxy. You're saying the precursors tried to exterminate your records. Not exterminate, erase. Chen leaned forward slightly and the motion was small but its effect was enormous, the sense of a vast attention narrowing, focusing like a telescope being adjusted to bring a single star into sharp relief. There's a difference, Commander. Extermination leaves evidence, bodies, ruins, traces that other species can find and study and learn from. Erasure leaves nothing. No records, no references, no artifacts with identifying inscriptions. They wanted the galaxy to forget we existed, and for 80,000 years it worked. He paused, and in the pause Tailvek heard the drive hum and the life support whisper and the distant vibration of Gareth's snoring, and the silence between those sounds had never felt so full. It almost worked entirely. If it weren't for a single data cache that they missed, a backup system and a forgotten maintenance station on a dead moon at the edge of their territory, we would have believed it ourselves, forgotten who we were. Become just another pre-spaceflight species wondering why the stars felt wrong. The weight of that statement settled over the bridge like a physical thing. Tailvek could feel it pressing down on his shoulders, on his crest, on the dual chambers of his heart. A single data cache, one missed backup. The entire survival of human civilization and human identity had depended on a failure of erasure so small that the builders had not noticed it. An error margin of 1. A single grain of sand that the tide had missed. And from that grain of sand 40,000 ships. An armada that filled the sky. A species that had been imprisoned and erased and forgotten and had clawed its way back from absolute zero to a level of technological sophistication that made the Velthari Unity look like children playing with coral fragments on a beach. "And why are you here now?" Tailvek asked. "Why break through at all? You said you could have dismantled the barrier. You said it was useful for developing in peace. So why leave? Why now?" Chen's expression changed. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible shift in the set of his jaw. A quality that entered his voice that the translation matrix could not quite identify and could only flag with a cultural note. Indication of resolved determination, possibly associated with fatalistic commitment. The expression of someone who has made a decision that cannot be unmade and has accepted the consequences. "Because the builders are coming back," Chen said, "and this time we intend to be ready." The silence that followed lasted nearly a full minute. Tailvek could hear the ambient hum of his own ship's systems, the distant vibration of the fusion drive, the whisper of air circulating through kilometers of conduits, the soft click of Vesara's claws against her console as her fingers spasmed involuntarily, a physical manifestation of a mind that had been pushed past its capacity to process. He could hear his own heart's beating, the twin chambers slightly out of sync, or a rhythmic flutter that Dr. Thessa would have classified as a stress-induced cardiac irregularity, and that Tailvek classified as the least of his problems. The human on the display waited. That was perhaps the most unsettling thing about this encounter. Not the armada, not the revelation, not even the face that made his prey instincts scream, but the patience. Chen sat in his cramped, angular bridge and waited with a stillness that felt almost inhuman. Not the controlled stillness of a Velthari officer maintaining professional composure. Tailvek knew that stillness intimately, had practiced it for decades, knew the effort it required. This was different. This was the patience of something that did not need to hurry because it had already accounted for every possible outcome and had determined that none of them required urgency. The patience of a mountain waiting for the wind to stop. "The builders are extinct," Tailvek finally said, and heard his own voice as if from a great distance, thin and strained and unconvincing even to himself. "They vanished over 80,000 years ago by your calendar. Yes, we know." Chen's voice carried no contempt, no triumph, no satisfaction at the Velthari commander's ignorance. Only a flat, clinical certainty that was worse than any of those things because it implied that the information he was about to deliver was so far beyond the scope of Velthari knowledge that correcting it was not even interesting. "They didn't vanish, Commander, they left, pulled their entire civilization out of this galaxy. Every world, every station, every artifact they could move. We found the departure logs on a ruined world near the galactic core about 600 years ago. Took us another century to decode enough of it to understand what we were reading." He gestured to someone off-screen, a casual wave of one hand, the kind of gesture that indicated comfort with one's surroundings and confidence in one's authority, and the display shifted. Chen's face minimized to a small image in the corner, replaced by a star chart that filled the main screen with a three-dimensional rendering of the Milky Way in its entirety. Billions of points of light, the spiral arms sweeping outward from the dense central bulge. The whole vast structure rotating slowly in the holographic display like a living thing. It was beautiful, Telvek had seen galactic maps before every Velthari officer had, but this one was different. It was annotated, not with Velthari notations, not with the tentative, speculative markings that the Unity's cartographers applied to regions they had only surveyed at a distance, but with precise, detailed, overwhelmingly comprehensive labels that covered every visible region of the galaxy with a density of information that made Telvek's eyes ache. Red markers, hundreds of them, thousands, concentrated in dense clusters along the galactic rim in the spaces between spiral arms in the dark voids where star formation was sparse and few civilizations had ever bothered to explore. Each marker pulsed gently, and beside each one was a string of human characters that the translation matrix rendered as alphanumeric designations, BN001 through BN4847. Those are builder monitoring stations, Chen said, his voice now coming from the small image in the corner while the map dominated the display. Automated, self-maintaining, powered by zero-point energy taps that will keep them running until the heat death of the universe. They've been watching, recording, measuring every species that has arisen in this galaxy since the builders left, every technological development, every slip drive signature, every communication transmission, everything. He paused and the red markers continued their gentle pulse, a slow heartbeat of surveillance that spanned the entire galaxy. And approximately 40 years ago, they all transmitted the same signal, inward, toward the intergalactic void. The display shifted again. The galactic map rotated and zoomed, pulling outward, the spiral arms shrinking to a bright core as the perspective pulled back beyond the galactic plane, beyond the halo of globular clusters, beyond the faint diffuse glow of the galactic corona, into the absolute darkness of intergalactic space. And there, far beyond the Milky Way's edge, a single point of light appeared, faint, tiny, almost lost in the vast darkness, but unmistakably present. The display drew a line from that point to the Milky Way, then another line, then dozens, hundreds, thousands of lines, all converging on the galaxy from the same origin point, fanning out like the fingers of a hand reaching toward a jewel. Projected trajectories based on the signal's vector and intensity, Chen said. We don't know how many ships are coming. The signal was compressed, encrypted in a code we haven't fully broken. But based on the energy output of the monitoring stations during transmission, stations that have been running on minimal power for 80 millennia and suddenly spiked to maximum output simultaneously, we estimate the signal was designed to reach something very far away and wake it up. Something very far away. Telvek looked at the origin point, the tiny speck of light in the intergalactic void, and tried to comprehend the distance it represented. The Milky Way was 100,000 light-years across. The nearest major galaxy, Andromeda, was 2.5 million light-years away. That point of light was not Andromeda. It was not any galaxy he recognized. It was in the void, the empty space between galaxies where there was nothing, where nothing could exist, where nothing should be going. Except something was. The builders designed whatever is in that signal as a cleanup protocol, Chen continued. And his voice had changed again, harder now, the clinical detachment giving way to something that Telvek's instincts classified as controlled fury, the anger of someone who had spent a long time thinking about an injustice and had arrived at a state of cold, focused hatred. If the quarantine failed, if any species broke through and established itself in the region they sealed, the protocol would trigger. Automated warships, we don't know how many, we don't know their capability, we only know they were designed to do what the builders themselves didn't have the stomach to finish. Telvek felt something shift inside him. Not fear exactly, fear was still there, a constant background radiation that colored every thought and sensation, but something else layered on top of it. Something older. Something his species hadn't truly felt since they had clawed their way up from the middle of Veltara's food chain, past the deep-water predators and the coastal hunters and the aerial swoopers that had made their ancestors' lives a daily exercise in terror. It was comprehension. Sudden, terrible, world-shattering comprehension, the feeling of a puzzle piece clicking into place with a force that rearranged everything around it. The quarantine wasn't to protect the galaxy from you, he said slowly, and heard the words come out of his mouth as if someone else were speaking them, as if his body had arrived at the understanding before his mind had caught up. It was to protect you from the cleanup. The small image of Chen in the corner of the display shifted. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, not in hostility, but in something that looked impossibly like respect. No, Chen agreed. It was to protect us from the cleanup. The builders didn't seal Sol to keep humanity contained. They sealed it to mark us, to make us the first target. If the cleanup wiped us out, the quarantine would hold evidence that the containment had worked, that the dangerous species had been eliminated, that the protocol was effective. If it didn't, he let the sentence hang in the air between them like a blade. If it didn't, humanity would be the only species with experience fighting builder technology, Telvek finished. Chen smiled. It was not a reassuring expression. The Velthari had no equivalent, their faces did not contort in that particular way, that upward curving of the mouth corners that humans perform to indicate pleasure or amusement, or in this case, something considerably darker. But Tailvik had read about humans smiling in the archaeological literature. He had seen the reconstructed diagrams of human facial musculature. He understood intellectually what the expression meant. Understanding it intellectually and being on the receiving end of it were very different experiences. The smile made Chen's face look like a mask, a pleasant, affable mask draped over something that was not pleasant and not affable. It was the smile of someone who had been handed a weapon and was deciding whether to use it. It was the smile of someone who had waited a very long time for this conversation and was savoring the moment of understanding that passed between them like a current. We've had 300 years to prepare, Commander. Chen's voice was quiet now, the fury banked but not extinguished, like coals beneath ash that could ignite at any moment. 300 years since we decoded the departure logs and understood what the builders had done to us. 300 years of building, training, preparing for one purpose. We reverse-engineered every piece of builder technology we could recover from the quarantine zone. We studied their weapons, their shields, their power systems. We found ruins, cities, stations, whole worlds that the builders abandoned when they left, still full of technology that they hadn't bothered to destroy because they didn't think anyone would ever be able to reach it. He paused and the smile faded, replaced by something that Tailvik could not name, but that made his crests rise despite himself. We reached it. 3 words, simple, declarative, unadorned. And in those 3 words was the entire history of a species that had been imprisoned, erased, forgotten, and left for dead. And that had responded not with despair, not with resignation, not with acceptance, but with 300 years of relentless, obsessive, furious preparation for a war that the rest of the galaxy did not even know was coming. Then what, Tailvik asked, after if you survive? The human's smile faded entirely. His eyes, those dark, forward-facing predator eyes, held Tailvik's gaze through the screen with an intensity that made his scales ripple. An involuntary response that he had not experienced since childhood, since the last time he had been truly, deeply afraid, since the last time something had looked at him the way a predator looks at something that is not food but is also not a threat. Then we come back, Chen said, and we make sure nothing like the builders ever threatens this galaxy again. Albeit, with or without help. It was not a threat. That was what Tailvik kept coming back to in the seconds and minutes that followed as the display shifted and the star chart minimized and the human admiral's face returned to fill the screen. It was not a demand. It was not an ultimatum. It was not any of the things that Velthari diplomatic training had prepared him to recognize and counter. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm assurance of a species that had spent 3 millennia inside a prison built by gods and had emerged not broken, not diminished, not begging for recognition or assistance or a place in the galactic community but forged, hardened, tempered. Changed into something that the galaxy had never seen, and that the Velthari, with their soft bioluminescent bridges and their organic interfaces, and their carefully maintained traditions of consensus governance, were spectacularly unprepared to deal with. Chen was still talking. Tailvik forced his attention back to the present, back to the words, back to the torrent of information that the human was delivering with the methodical precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times and knew exactly what he wanted to communicate and in what order. Estimated arrival time of the cleanup force is between 60 and 120 years, depending on their drive capabilities, which we can only guess at. Our own slip drive technology is based on builder principles, but incorporates significant modifications that we believe give us an edge in both speed and maneuverability. The Armada you see around you, he gestured off-screen again, and for a brief moment the display shifted to show an external view of the human fleet, a vast wall of dark angular shapes trailing blue-white drive plumes, stretching in every direction to the limits of visibility, and Tailvik's mind simply refused to process the scale of it. Rejected the data the way a body rejects poison, shutting down the cognitive pathways that would have been required to comprehend what he was seeing. Represents approximately 40% of our total military capacity. The remainder is still in Sol system, completing final preparations. We plan to rendezvous at the contact point in approximately 18 months. 40%. What Tailvik was seeing, this incomprehensible galaxy-spanning armada that filled the sky and dimmed the stars and made his 12 ships look like dust motes in a sunbeam, was less than half. He was going to be sick. The thermal spike in his blood had peaked and was now crashing, leaving him cold and shaky, his crests drooping slightly from their hypercrestive peak, his vision narrowing at the edges as his body redirected blood from non-essential systems to deal with the metabolic crisis that his brain had created by refusing to stop flooding his system with stress hormones. I need a moment, he said. It was the hardest thing he had ever said, harder than the words he had spoken at his father's funeral, harder than the casualty reports he had signed after the Thraxis skirmish, harder than the mission briefing to his crew before they crossed the veil. To say I need a moment in front of his crew, in front of a representative of a species that should not exist, in front of the most significant discovery in Velthari history, to admit weakness, to acknowledge that his mind had reached its limit, went against every principle of Velthari command training, every expectation of the Unity Officer Corps, every lesson his instructors had beaten into him at the academy. Chen nodded, a small single downward movement of his chin, no commentary, no judgment. No expression at all except a slight softening around the eyes that the translation matrix flagged as indication of empathy or recognition. Take your time, Commander. Tailvek turned from the display and walked to the far end of the bridge, past the sensor stations where Ketha and her unnamed colleague sat frozen in their seats, past the medical officer who had risen and was standing with her hands pressed flat against the console as if to steady herself, past Gareth who was still snoring, and stopped at the observation port. The viewport that had shown him nothing for 17 days now showed him everything. The Armada. The cloud of nanomaterial that surrounded it like a shroud. The dimmed stars. The blue-white drive plumes that stretched in every direction like the veins of some vast living creature, pulsing with energy, carrying humanity forward through the void toward an enemy that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed. He pressed his forehead against the cool crystalline composite and closed his eyes. Behind his closed eyelids he saw the histories. The archives he had studied as a young officer, the fragmentary texts that had sparked the obsession that had carried him to this moment. The oldest known reference to humanity, recovered from a builder archive on a ruined world in what was now Thraxis space. A single line of text, damaged almost beyond legibility, translated with great difficulty and greater uncertainty as the aggressive species from the third world of Sol, contained but not eliminated danger status, maximum. The later references scattered across a dozen builder databases, each one adding a fragment to the picture. A species that had been discovered by the builders during their peak, assessed as an existential threat despite being pre-spaceflight, quarantined with extraordinary measures and then erased. Written out of history. Removed from every record the builders could access. The Velthari scholars had debated those fragments for centuries. Some argued they were fiction, builder myths, cautionary tales, allegories about the dangers of unchecked aggression. Others argued they were historical but exaggerated. The builders had encountered a primitive species and overreacted, as powerful civilizations sometimes did. A small minority argued that the fragments were literally true, that a species called humanity had actually existed and had actually been quarantined, but even this minority generally conceded that whatever humans had been, they were long extinct. The quarantine was a relic, a monument to builder paranoia, nothing more. None of them, not the skeptics, not the literalists, not the most imaginative speculator in the most obscure corner of the Unity's academic establishment, had imagined this. A living species, a thriving civilization, an armada that dwarfed anything the Velthari had ever built or conceived of building. A technological base derived from 300 years of reverse-engineered builder technology, modified and improved and innovated beyond by minds that the builders themselves had considered too dangerous to allow to develop. And a mission, a purpose, a reason for existing that was not comfort or trade or exploration or any of the things that drove Velthari civilization but war, preparations for war. 3 centuries of singular, focused, obsessive preparation for a war against the same builders who had created the quarantine, who had, in Chen's telling, not merely quarantined humanity but sacrificed it, turned an entire species into a tripwire for a cleanup protocol that the builders had designed but been unwilling to execute themselves. The moral weight of that settled over Tailvek like a burial shroud. He could not see the galaxy the same way, could not see the builder ruins that dotted Velthari space with their elegant architecture and their advanced technology and their mysterious disappearance as benign relics of a wise predecessor civilization. The builders were not wise, they were not benign, they were cowards. They had created a cleanup protocol to handle the consequences of their own paranoia and then fled the galaxy rather than face those consequences themselves, leaving the cleanup and the species it was designed to destroy, to deal with each other while they watched from beyond the galactic edge. And humanity, the erased species, the forgotten species, the species that the entire galaxy had agreed was a myth, had spent 3,000 years in that quarantine, slowly, patiently, furiously preparing to fight a war that was not their fault against an enemy that had already run away. Something cracked inside Tailvek, not breaking, nothing so dramatic or final, but cracking the way ice cracks on a river in spring, a network of fine fractures spreading through something that had been solid for a very long time. It was his understanding of the universe, his sense of how things worked. His quiet, unexamined assumption that the Velthari were a significant species in a galaxy that, while large and mysterious, was ultimately comprehensible, that the unknown could be mapped, the dangerous could be managed, and the past, however mysterious, was ultimately past. None of that was true. The universe was larger than he had imagined. The dangerous could not be managed by a species that did not even know the danger existed. And the past was not past. The past was coming. It was coming from beyond the galactic edge in ships built by a civilization that had fled rather than fought, and it was coming for humanity first. And then Chen's words echoed in his mind with the persistence of a bell struck in an empty chamber. Then we come back. He opened his eyes. The Armada filled the viewport. It was closer now, much closer than it had been when he had first looked, though whether that was because the fleet had moved or because his perception had shifted, he could not say. The individual ships were still too far away to resolve clearly, but their shapes were distinct. Angular, aggressive, designed for function rather than aesthetics, every surface oriented toward some tactical purpose, weapon emplacements, sensor arrays, drive nacelles, armor plating, without a single wasted curve or decorative element. They looked like weapons. They looked like what they were, the instruments of a species that had been wronged and had spent 3 centuries building the means to set it right. Behind him, he heard a sound. A low, rough, gravelly sound like stone grinding against stone. He turned. Gareth was awake. The old engineer was standing at his station, his worn crest raised to what passed for full extension on his degraded physiology, perhaps 60% of the height it would have been in youth, the blunt nubs catching the dim red emergency lighting like broken teeth. His eyes were open, and they were not the eyes of a being who had just woken up. They were the eyes of someone who had been listening for a long time, perhaps the entire time, who had heard every word Chen had said through the fog of sleep, and had been processing it with the same slow, methodical patience that he applied to every engineering problem. 300 years, Gareth said. His voice was a ruin, cracked, wheezing, the vocal cords degraded by age to the point where every word sounded like it cost him something. But the words were clear. 300 years to build that. He raised one trembling, liver-spotted hand and pointed at the viewport, at the Armada, at the wall of human ships that stretched to the edge of vision. And we've had 800 years of peace and built, he paused, and the pause was not for breath but for effect because Gareth does nothing without purpose, even in his dotage. 12 ships. No one responded. There was nothing to say. Gareth had articulated in his blunt, brutal engineer's way the gap that Talvik had been trying not to think about. Not just the technological gap, though that was staggering enough, but the civilizational gap. The difference between a species that had spent 8 centuries building trade routes and senate chambers and research stations, and a species that had spent 3 centuries building a war machine capable of fighting the most advanced civilization the galaxy had ever produced. I told you, Gareth continued, lowering his hand and fixing Talvik with a look that carried the weight of 40 years of deep space experience. I told you the void wasn't empty. I told you the archives were wrong. I told you, his voice cracked, and for a moment the old engineer's composure fractured, and Talvik saw beneath it something raw and painful and deeply, profoundly human, a word he used here deliberately because there was no Velthari word for what Gareth was feeling, and perhaps that was the point. I told you the stories were true. Talvik held the old engineer's gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. A single, slow, downward movement of his chin, mirroring unconsciously the gesture Chen had made moments ago, and in that nod was an acknowledgement of everything Gareth had said, everything Gareth had risked in volunteering for this mission, everything Gareth had known without being able to prove. You told me, Talvik agreed. He turned back to the display. Chen's face was still there, still waiting, still patient, still wearing that expression of controlled determination that made Talvik's instincts scream and his intellect marvel in equal measure. The human had not interrupted the moment, had not pressed for a response. Had simply sat in his cramped, angular bridge and allowed the Velthari commander to process at his own pace, as if the outcome of this encounter was already determined and Chen was merely waiting for Talvik to arrive at the same conclusion. Which Talvik realized it probably was. He straightened to his full height, drew a slow breath through his nostrils, filling his lungs, feeling the air cool the thermal spike in his blood, bringing his body back to something approaching equilibrium. His crest rose not to the hypercrestive peak of earlier, but to a measured, deliberate full extension, each serration rigid and visible, the Velthari body's unequivocal signal of formal respect offered only to equals. Admiral Chen, Talvik said, and was quietly, privately astonished at the steadiness of his own voice, because inside he was still shaking, still reeling, still trying to integrate a revelation that had shattered every assumption he had ever held about the galaxy and his species' place in it. On behalf of the Velthari unity, I do not have the authority to make commitments or alliances. I am a reconnaissance commander, not an ambassador. What I can tell you is that the Unity Senate will need to be informed of everything you have shared with me, about the builders, about the cleanup protocol, about your armada and your intentions. That process will take time. Bureaucratic time. The kind of time that civilizations use to convince themselves that unpleasant truths are not real. He paused. Chen's expression had not changed, but something in his eyes, a flicker, a shift, the briefest contraction of the muscles around the iris, suggested that he understood where this was going and was prepared to wait. However, Tailvek continued, and now his voice shifted, gaining a quality that he did not recognize as his own. A resonance, a depth, a weight that seemed to come from somewhere below his chest, from a place where the prey instinct and the commander's discipline and the something else that had cracked inside him had merged into something new. I am not going back, not yet, not without seeing what you have shown me with my own eyes. Not without understanding, at the level of direct observation rather than second-hand report, what the builders did to you and what you have built in response. He felt rather than saw the reaction of his bridge crew, a collective intake of breath, a ripple of crest movements, the particular quality of silence that falls when a commander says something that no one expected. Visara's crest had risen to full extension. Orak's bluntneck crest had flushed darker, the deep-water variant's equivalent of wide eyes. Even the new technicians had stopped their shallow, panicked breathing, caught in the gravity of the moment. "Commander," Visara said softly, and in her voice was a warning. Not about the humans, not about the Armada, but about the chain of command, about the Unity Senate, about the consequences of a military officer making decisions that exceeded his authorization. It was the warning that every good communications officer was trained to give, and it was the right warning, and it was also, Tailvek understood in that moment, irrelevant. "Noted sub-lieutenant," he said without looking at her. He looked at Chen. Chen looked at him. The display transmitted their faces across the gulf between their ships, a gulf that was physical, technological, and civilizational all at once. And in that transmission, something passed between them that was not language and not gesture and not any form of communication that either species had formally codified. It was recognition, the acknowledgement of one intelligent being by another that they were both standing at the same edge, looking into the same abyss, and that the abyss was looking back. "I have a request," Tailvik said. Chen tilted his head, that same slight rotation, that same assessing quality. "I'm listening. Allow me to accompany your fleet to the contact point. My ships, my crew, not as allies, we have no authority to offer alliance. Not as observers, the Unity does not send military vessels as observers. As," he searched for the word, found it. "As witnesses, let us see what you have built. Let us see what you face. Let us carry that knowledge back to the Unity not as data on a screen but as experience in the minds of living beings who were there." Chen studied him. The human's face was unreadable. Tailvik had no reference points for interpreting human microexpressions, no database of cultural norms to draw on, nothing but his own instinct and the primitive prey-animal awareness that had kept his ancestors alive, and so he could not tell what Chen was thinking. He could not tell whether the request would be granted or refused. He could not tell whether Chen saw him as a potential ally, a potential liability, or a potential hostage. He could only stand and wait, and hope that the something that had cracked inside him had cracked in the right direction. Then Chen smiled again, that same unsettling, mask-like expression that did not reach his eyes, and said, "Commander, I was hoping you'd say that." He glanced off-screen, and the tactical display shifted, the external view of the Armada replacing his face for a moment before zooming out to show the formation in its entirety, or as much of its entirety as the display could render, which was still only a fraction. The formation moved. Not dramatically, not aggressively, just a subtle shift in the positions of thousands of ships, a recalibration of defensive spheres and screening elements, an opening appearing in the vast wall of vessels like a door being unsealed in an impossibly large wall. "Take position behind the vanguard," Chen said, his voice returning to the display as the tactical view minimized. "We'll brief you en route. Everything we know about the builders, the cleanup protocol, the estimated composition of the incoming force, and our tactical plans for dealing with it." A pause, and in the pause the smile faded and the flat, controlled determination returned, and Tailvik understood that the smile had been a courtesy, human social convention perhaps, or a deliberate gesture of reassurance designed to put a frightened alien commander at ease, and that what followed was the real Chen, the Chen that existed beneath the social performance. "Fair warning, Commander. Some of what we'll share is going to be difficult for your people to accept. Not just technically, though the technology gap is significant, but conceptually. The builders were not what your archaeologists think they were, and what's coming is not what anyone in this galaxy is prepared to face." "You've said that twice now," Tailvik observed. "That we're not prepared. You seem very certain of our limitations for someone who's been observing us for 400 years. Chen's eyes narrowed, not in anger, something else. Something that the translation matrix, struggling to keep up with the nuances of human expression, flagged as indication of respect, possibly tinged with ruefulness. I'm certain of your limitations because I've studied them, Chen said. Your species is young, Commander. Not in biological terms, you've been around as long as we have, give or take a few million years, but in civilizational terms. You've had 800 years of spaceflight and most of that has been peaceful. You've never fought a war against a peer opponent. You've never faced an existential threat. You've never had to make the kinds of choices that war demands, the sacrifices, the compromises, the decisions that haunt you for the rest of your life. He paused, and something moved behind his eyes, not a memory exactly, but the shadow of a memory, the impression of something vast and terrible that existed just below the surface of his consciousness. We have 3,000 years of isolation, Commander, 3,000 years of knowing that the galaxy forgot us. 3,000 years of building and training and preparing for a war we didn't start against an enemy that already ran away. That changes a species. That changes everything. The channel closed. The display reverted to its default state. Tactical overview, 12 blue icons representing the Unity fleet, and beyond them, now rendered in real-time sensor data rather than projection, the vast sprawl of the human armada. The corridor that Chen had opened was visible on the display. A gap in the formation, roughly 2 kilometers wide, leading inward toward the center of the armada where the largest masses registered, carrier groups, support vessels, and something else, something enormous that the sensors could detect but could not classify, its gravitational signature so large and so irregular that the computer kept cycling through designations. Unknown massive object, possible station, possible vessel, classification uncertain. Aurak was already moving. Commander plotting course to the designated entry point, estimated transit time at standard approach speed, 32 minutes. Take us in, Lieutenant. The resolute judgment stirred beneath Tailvek's feet. The fusion drive's hum deepened as the ship adjusted its heading, and through the viewport he watched the stars shift as the vessel turned. Not the slow, majestic turn of a Velthari cruiser at standard maneuvering speed, but something faster, tighter, more precise, because Aurak was a deepwater navigator and deepwater navigators did not waste time. The other 11 ships in the formation followed in perfect synchronization, their movements choreographed by the fleet's tactical AI with a smoothness that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. The Armada grew. As they approached the corridor, the individual ships that had been indistinct silhouettes at the edge of visual range began to resolve into recognizable forms. They were not beautiful. Tailvek had expected absurdly that a species capable of building 40,000 warships might also have developed some sense of aesthetic proportion, but they were not ugly either. They were purposeful. Every surface, every angle, every protrusion served a function. Weapon turrets clustered around reactor housings. Sensor arrays bristled from extended booms that kept them clear of drive emissions. Armor plating was layered and angled to deflect incoming fire rather than absorb it, a design philosophy that suggested hard-won experience with weapons that could penetrate any reasonable thickness of armor. The ships were tools, weapons, instruments of a single, overriding purpose. And there were so many of them, so many that the mind rebelled. As the resolute judgment entered the corridor, ships passed on either side, close enough now that Tailvek could see details, close enough that he could make out the markings on their hulls, the scarring from what might have been weapons testing or actual combat, the faint glow of active defense systems that tracked his ship's approach with the lazy attention of sentries who had identified a target and determined it was not a threat. They passed one ship, then 10, then 100, then 1,000, and still the corridor stretched ahead, and still the ships kept coming, and still the armada showed no sign of ending. Vesara was counting. He could hear her murmuring under her breath, a professional habit, cataloging contacts as they passed, maintaining a running tally that she knew was futile but that her training compelled her to maintain anyway. She stopped at 3,412 and did not start again. Ketha had abandoned all pretense of sensor analysis and was simply staring at her instruments with the blank, overwhelmed expression of someone whose data processing capacity had been exceeded. Her console was flashing alerts, hundreds of them, thousands, each one representing a new contact entering sensor range, each one demanding attention that she did not have to give. Dr. Thessa had returned to her feet and was standing very still, her hands clasped in front of her, her crest at a moderate height, her expression one of clinical fascination that Tailvek suspected was her way of coping with fear. He made a mental note to ask her later about the medical implications of what they were experiencing, the neurological effects of first contact with a species that exceeded all expectations, the stress responses, the long-term psychological consequences. If there was a later. Gareth was standing at his station with his eyes fixed on the viewport, his ancient face tilted upward toward the armada, his worn crest raised as high as it would go, and on his face was an expression that Tailvek had never seen before. It was not fear. It was not wonder. It was not the professional composure of an officer or the clinical detachment of a physician or the stunned overload of a sensor technician. It was joy. Pure, uncomplicated, radiant joy. The expression of a being who had spent his entire life believing in something that everyone else said was impossible and who had finally been proven right. Gareth's eyes were bright. Wet Tailvek realized with a start the old engineer was crying, tears tracking down his faded lavender skin and dripping from his jaw, and his mouth was open in what might have been a smile if Velthari mouths could smile, and his whole body was trembling but not with fear. With something else, something that the Velthari language, for all its richness and precision, did not have a word for. I was right, Gareth whispered, just those two words, I was right. Tailvek turned from the old engineer and looked at the viewport. The Armada filled it completely now. No stars visible, no void, no nothing, just ships. An endless procession of human warships passing on either side of the corridor like the walls of a canyon made of metal and light. The blue-white drive plumes reflected off the Resolute Judgment's hull, casting shifting patterns of light across the bridge that made the organic curves of the Velthari design look alien and out of place. A soft living thing in a canyon of hard angular stone. And somewhere ahead at the center of it all, the unknown massive object waited. The legends were real. They were real and they were here and they were going to war, and the galaxy would never be the same. Tailvek stood on the bridge of his tiny ship, 12 vessels against 40,800 years of peace against 3 millennia of preparation. A species that had forgotten how to fight against a species that had never known anything else, and felt the something that had cracked inside him finish cracking, and what was left was not broken but open, like a door that had been sealed for a very long time and had finally been pushed wide. He did not know what was on the other side of that door. But he intended to find out. The corridor of ships lasted 41 minutes. Tailvek counted every one of them. Not literally, he was not Vesara, did not have her gift for simultaneous tracking and cataloging. But he counted them in the way that a prey species counts the steps between cover and exposure. Each passing vessel a marker of distance traveled and distance remaining. His mind turning the endless procession of warships into a kind of rosary that kept his thoughts anchored to something concrete, while the vastness of what he was experiencing threatened to sweep him away entirely. The ships changed as they went deeper. At the perimeter, the outermost shell of the Armada that they had first encountered, the vessels had been uniform in design. Medium-sized warships with a standard layout of weapon turrets, sensor arrays, and drive nacelles, each one a copy of its neighbors with only minor variations in hull markings and scar patterns. They were the frontline combatants, the first to engage any threat, the expendable edge of a very sharp sword. Tailvek had studied them through the viewport with the analytical eye of a naval officer, noting the weapon arc coverage, the apparent thickness of the armor plating, the positioning of point defense systems that suggested extensive experience with missile and projectile threats. They were competent designs, efficient, practical, the kind of ships that a civilization builds when it needs many of them quickly and cannot afford elegance. As the Resolute Judgment penetrated deeper, passing through the outer defensive sphere and entering the second layer of the formation, the ships changed. They grew larger, not incrementally but dramatically, as if the Armada's designers had decided that the transition between layers should be as abrupt as possible, a clear demarcation between the expendable and the valuable. These were not copies. Each vessel in the second layer was unique, or nearly so, variations on a common theme but with enough individual differences in proportion and configuration that Tailvek realized he was looking at ships from different construction eras, different shipyards, perhaps even different design philosophies competing within the same fleet. Some were sleek, their surfaces smoothed and tapered in ways that suggested an emphasis on speed over armor. Others were bulky, their hulls studded with so many weapon emplacements that they looked less like warships and more like mobile weapons platforms with engines attached. A few, very few, were things that Tailvek could not classify at all, their configurations so alien to his understanding of naval architecture that his mind simply refused to engage, sliding over them the way water slides over a surface that is too hot to touch. And behind them, beyond the second layer, beyond a third layer that was more sparse but contained the largest individual ships Tailvek had ever seen, vessels that dwarfed the Resolute Judgment by factors of 10 and 20 and 50, was the center. The unknown massive object that the sensors had been unable to classify. It appeared in the viewport slowly, the way a mountain appears when you round a bend in a canyon. First a shadow, a darkness against the darkness, a region where the drive plumes of surrounding ships seemed to bend and distort as if light itself was being affected by something of extraordinary mass. Then a shape began to emerge, not a ship, not a station, not anything that Tailvek's experience could categorize. It was a structure. Vast beyond vast, extending across the viewport in every direction, filling the center of the Armada like a heart fills a chest. its surfaces covered in lights and openings and protrusions that suggested a complexity of function that no single mind could comprehend. "Commander," Ketha's voice from the sensor station, and it was barely a voice at all, a thin, reedy thread of sound that seemed to come from very far away, as if Ketha's mind had retreated to a distance from which the thing outside the viewport could be safely observed. "I am attempting to classify the central structure. My instruments are returning contradictory data. It appears to be simultaneously a ship, a station, and a habitat, with mass characteristics consistent with a small moon but an internal energy signature consistent with." She stopped. Tailvik turned to look at her. Her crest was not merely flat against her skull, it was pressed into her skull, the bony serrations actually compressing the skin of her scalp in a way that looked painful, the Velthari body's extreme stress response. The thing that happened when the mind encountered something so far outside its parameters that the body's only remaining option was to try to make itself as small as possible. "Consistent with what?" Tailvik asked gently. "With a star, Commander." Ketha's eyes were wide, the vertical pupils dilated to near circular, and in them Tailvik saw something he had never seen in a Velthari face, not fear, not shock, but inadequacy. The expression of a being whose tools had failed them, whose instruments had reached their limit, whose ability to understand the universe had hit a wall that could not be climbed or gone around. The internal energy signature is consistent with a low-mass star undergoing stable hydrogen fusion. Inside the structure, they have put a star inside the structure. The bridge was silent. Even Gareth's snoring had stopped. He had woken again, or perhaps had never fully been asleep, and was staring at the sensor readouts on the nearest console with an expression that might have been professional evaluation, or might have been mindless bewilderment, or might have been something for which there was no name in any language. Tailvik turned back to the viewports. The structure was visible in its entirety now, or as much of its entirety as the viewport could show, which was still only a fraction. It was roughly spherical, perhaps 40 kilometers in diameter, its surface a patchwork of materials and textures that suggested incremental construction over a very long period, some sections smooth and new-looking, others pitted and scarred, still others showing the unmistakable discoloration of Builder-era materials, the same blue-gray alloys that appeared in every precursor ruin the Velthari had ever catalogued. They had built onto Builder technology, incorporated it, made it part of something new. The structure was not purely human and not purely Builder but a hybrid, a chimera, a fusion of two completely different technological traditions into something that belonged to neither and surpassed both. And at its center, according to Ketha's instruments, was a star. Tailvik closed his eyes, opened them. The structure was still there. It had not vanished, had not resolved into a sensor artifact, had not been revealed as a natural phenomenon misread by confused instruments. It was real, it was there. It was the largest constructed object he had ever seen or heard of or imagined, and it contained a star, and it was the flagship of a fleet of 40,000 ships crewed by a species that the galaxy had forgotten. He began to laugh. It was not a good laugh. It was not the controlled, measured expression of amusement that Velthari social norms demanded. It was a high, sharp, slightly hysterical sound, the laugh of a mind that has been pushed past its limits and has found somewhere in the wreckage of its composure something so absurd, so magnificently and transcendently absurd that the only possible response is laughter. His crests vibrated with it, his shoulders shook, his eyes watered. The bridge crew stared at him. He could feel their stares like physical touches, concerned, frightened, wondering whether their commander had finally broken under the pressure of an encounter that no Velthari had ever been trained to handle. He did not care, he could not care. The laughter was happening, and he could not stop it, and after a moment he did not want to stop it, because the laughter was the only thing between him and the abyss of comprehension that yawned beneath his feet. And if he stopped laughing, he would fall, and if he fell, he would never stop falling. "A star," he said between laughs. "They put a star inside a ship." Another laugh, sharper, higher. "The builders quarantined them because they were dangerous, and they responded by putting a star inside a ship." The laughter faded, not because the absurdity had diminished. It had not, it would never diminish, he would carry the image of that structure to his grave, but because something else was rising in its place. Something that the laughter had been holding back like a hand pressed against a wound, and now the hand was removed and the wound was open, and what poured out was not blood but clarity. He understood. Not everything, his mind was still reeling, still struggling to integrate the sheer volume of new information that had been dumped into it over the past hour, still bumping against concepts that it could not fully grasp. But he understood the central fact, the core truth, the thing that tied everything together and gave it meaning and made it not just a sequence of terrifying revelations but a story. A narrative with a beginning and a middle and soon an ending. The builders had been afraid of humanity's potential. Not their technology, not their numbers, not their aggression, their potential. The capacity to become something that exceeded every framework the builders possessed for understanding what a species could be. The builders had looked at a pre-spaceflight civilization and had seen somehow what that civilization could become if given time and motivation, and the vision had terrified them, and they had tried to erase it. And they had failed. Not because their technology was insufficient. By all accounts, the quarantine had worked perfectly for 80,000 years, and the erasure had been nearly total, and the cleanup protocol was a failsafe designed to handle exactly the scenario that had now come to pass. They had failed because they had misunderstood what they were trying to erase. They had thought they were containing a species, a biological population, a technological civilization, a political entity that could be isolated and monitored and, if necessary, destroyed. But humanity was not those things. Humanity was an idea, a pattern. A way of responding to the universe that was not dependent on any specific technology or political structure or even any specific individuals, but that persisted and adapted and reinvented itself with every generation, like a flame that jumps from fuel to fuel, never quite the same but always in its essence fire. The builders had tried to extinguish a fire by removing the wood, and the fire had found other things to burn. Commander, Visara's voice, steady now, the tremor gone, replaced by something that Tailvek recognized with a start as professional composure. Not the shallow, brittle composure of an officer pretending to be calm, but the deep, genuine composure of someone who has passed through fear and arrived at something on the other side. Admiral Chen is hailing us again. He says we've arrived at the designated anchorage and there's a briefing prepared for us. He says, she paused, and something flickered across her face. Not quite a smile, Velthari didn't smile, but the ghost of an expression that occupied the same emotional territory. He says he'll understand if we need a few minutes. Tailvek drew a slow breath, held it, released it. The laughter had left something behind, not calm exactly, but order. A sense that the chaos of the past hour had settled into a configuration that, while still overwhelming, was at least navigable. He could function, he could think, he could be a commander. Tell him we're ready, he said. The briefing was not held on the resolute judgment. That had been Tailvek's assumption, that Chen would transmit the briefing materials electronically, or that a human delegation would come to the Velthari ship, or that the briefing would take place through the display system that had carried their conversation so far. Instead, 10 minutes after Vesara acknowledged Chen's hail, a small craft detached from the structure, a shuttle sleek and fast, with the same angular design language as the warships but on a much smaller scale, and approached the resolute judgment with the casual confidence of a ferry approaching a dock. They're requesting docking clearance, Vesara reported, and there was a note in her voice, not quite disbelief, not quite alarm, but something adjacent to both. Main cargo bay, they say the shuttle requires a minimum clearance of, she checked the readout, 12 meters by 8 meters by 6 meters. The Resolute Judgment's main cargo bay was 20 meters by 15. It could accommodate the shuttle easily. That was not the point. The point was that a human vessel was about to enter a Velthari warship for the first time in the history of both species, and the protocols for such an event did not exist because no one had ever imagined it would happen. Grant clearance, Tailvek said. Commander Tailvek to all hands, he paused, triggered the shipwide communication system, and felt the weight of every soul on the Resolute Judgment focusing on his voice. All hands, this is the commander. We are about to receive a human delegation aboard this vessel. I want every crew member at their station or in their assigned quarters. No one is to approach the cargo bay without explicit authorization from me or Sub-Lieutenant Vesara. No one is to initiate communication with the human delegation unless directly addressed. No one is to touch any equipment or materials brought aboard by the delegation. These are not precautions against a threat, they are protocols of respect. We are guests in their space. They are extending a courtesy by coming to ours. Do not make me regret allowing this. Tailvek out. He turned to Vesara, you're with me. Sir, I should remain at communications. You're with me, Sub-Lieutenant, that's not a request. Vesara's crest flickered, a rapid micro-movement that indicated suppressed protest. But she did not argue. She disengaged from her console with the precise, deliberate movements of an officer who is unhappy with an order but professional enough to execute it without complaint, and followed Tailvek off the bridge. The corridor to the cargo bay was long 200 meters of gently curving passage lined with bioluminescent panels that pulsed with the soft blue-white light of the ship's ambient systems. Tailvek walked quickly, his digitigrade feet clicking against the organic deck. Vesara's lighter tread a half-step behind. They passed crew members who pressed themselves against the walls as they went, their crests at various heights of agitation, their eyes wide, their bodies radiating the particular energy of people who know that something unprecedented is happening nearby and are torn between the desire to witness it and the instinct to stay as far away as possible. The cargo bay doors were already open when they arrived. Inside the bay was a vast cathedral-like space, the largest single interior volume on the ship, designed to accommodate cargo containers, shuttlecraft, and in emergencies the entire crew in evacuation configuration. The overhead was 15 meters above the deck, studded with maintenance access points and cargo handling equipment. The walls were lined with storage compartments and environmental control systems. The deck was marked with guidance lines and safety zones, all of it bathed in the same soft blue-white bioluminescence that permeated every Velthari space. The human shuttle sat in the center of it like a stone in a stream. It was smaller than Tailvek had expected, perhaps 20 meters from nose to tail, with a wingspan of maybe 15 meters, its angular surfaces a dark gray that seemed to absorb the bioluminescent light rather than reflect it. There were no visible windows, no markings beyond a small identification number stenciled on the hull in human characters. No indication of whether it was armed, though Tailvek assumed it was, because everything about this species suggested that assumption was the safe one. The shuttle's forward hatch opened. Light spilled out, not the harsh white of the warship bridges Tailvek had seen on the display, but a warmer, softer illumination that was almost but not quite Velthari blue. A deliberate choice, Tailvek realized. The humans had adjusted their shuttle's interior lighting to approximate Velthari standards. It was a small thing, trivial really, a detail that most people would not have noticed. But Tailvek noticed it, and the noticing told him something important about the humans that no amount of Armada watching could have conveyed. They were thoughtful, not merely intelligent, not merely capable of building starships and reverse engineering builder technology and constructing structures with stars inside them, but thoughtful in the specific, interpersonal, empathetic sense of the word. They had considered how their arrival would feel to a Velthari crew. They had anticipated the sensory dissonance of a human environment inside a Velthari ship. And they had made an adjustment, a tiny, cosmetic, almost meaningless adjustment, to reduce that dissonance. It was the act of a species that understood that first contact was not merely an exchange of information, but an exchange of experiences, and that the quality of that exchange would determine everything that followed. 3 humans emerged from the shuttle. The first was Chen. Tailvek recognized him immediately from the display, the same dark uniform, the same short-cropped hair, the same unreadable face. In person, he was smaller than Tailvek had expected. Not short by human standards, presumably, but shorter than a Velthari, more compact, his proportions different in ways that the two-dimensional display had not conveyed. He moved with a loose, easy gait that suggested physical confidence without aggression, the walk of someone who was comfortable in his body and comfortable in his environment, and saw no reason to be otherwise. The second was a female human, taller than Chen, with darker skin and hair that was pulled back from her face in a tight arrangement that exposed the full structure of her skull, giving her an angular, severe appearance that was oddly compelling. She wore a uniform similar to Chen's but with different markings, and she carried under one arm a device that Tailvek's instincts classified as a data storage unit of some kind. Her eyes swept the cargo bay with a rapid, systematic pattern that Tailvek recognized as a tactical assessment, the same sweep he performed himself when entering an unfamiliar space. The third was not in uniform. This human was older, much older, his face lined and weathered, his hair not merely short but gone, the top of his head smooth and shiny under the cargo bay lights. He wore loose-fitting clothing in muted colors that bore no rank insignia or institutional markings of any kind. He walked slowly, carefully, one hand touching the shuttle's hull as he descended the ramp as if to steady himself, and his eyes, brown like Chen's but lighter with flecks of amber that caught the bioluminescent light, were not scanning the cargo bay tactically. They were looking at it, taking it in, studying the curved walls and the organic consoles and the soft pulsing light with an expression that Tailvek, after a moment of bewilderment, identified as wonder. The old human was looking at a Velthari cargo bay the way Gareth had looked at the Armada. Chen reached the deck and stopped. The other 2 humans arranged themselves beside him, the uniformed female to his right, the old man to his left, slightly behind. A formation, deliberate, Chen in the center, the position of authority but flanked by representatives of what, Tailvek wondered, military and civilian, command and science, action and contemplation. Commander Tailvek, Chen spoke in standard Velthari. The words hit Tailvek like a physical blow, not because of their content, he had been expecting communication, but because of their form. Standard Velthari was the formal dialect used in official proceedings and diplomatic exchanges. It was not the language of casual conversation. It was not the language that a species learned from passively monitoring communications. It was the language that you learned from studying Velthari civilization in depth, from reading Velthari literature and analyzing Velthari political discourse, and understanding the cultural nuances that separated standard from the dozen regional variants spoken across Velthari space. The humans had not merely been watching. They had been studying. For 400 years, they had been studying Velthari language, Velthari culture, Velthari everything, with a thoroughness that made their passive observation sound like the most active intelligence operation in the history of the galaxy. I am Admiral Chen. This is Captain Okonkwo, my operations officer. He gestured to the uniformed female who gave a single sharp nod, a human gesture that the translation protocols identified as a formal acknowledgement. And this is Dr. Ezra Hale, our chief xenologist and the person on this ship who knows more about Velthari culture than most Velthari do. The old man Hale smiled. It was a different smile from Chen's, warmer, more genuine, less controlled. It crinkled the skin around his eyes and pulled the corners of his mouth upward in a way that was, Telvek found to his own surprise, not unsettling but actually pleasant. The smile of someone who was genuinely happy to be where he was, seeing what he was seeing, meeting who he was meeting. Commander, Hale said, and his Velthari was even better than Chen's, richer, more nuanced, carrying inflections and tonal variations that suggested not just fluency but immersion, the kind of deep linguistic competence that came from living inside a language rather than merely learning it. I have read every Velthari text your long-range transmissions have allowed us to intercept over the past 4 centuries. Your poetry is extraordinary. The way your language handles the concept of the space between stars as a living presence is something no human language can replicate. I have been looking forward to this moment for a very long time. Telvek stared at the old human. The old human stared back, his amber-flecked eyes bright with an enthusiasm that was almost childlike in its intensity, and Telvek felt something shift inside him, something that had been tight and rigid and defensive since the moment the first human transmission had appeared on his display. It was not trust. It was too early for trust. But it was the absence of the expectation of threat, the recognition that the entities standing in front of him were not merely weapons in uniform but people, complex and multifaceted and capable of wonder, and that the armada outside his ship was not merely a war machine, but the product of a civilization that contained Ezra Hale's as well as James Chen's. Dr. Hale, Telvek said carefully, I am gratified to hear that our poetry has found an audience beyond the veil. Though I confess that the space between stars as a living presence is not a concept I expected a species that builds structures around stars to appreciate. Hale's smile widened. Ah, but that's precisely why we appreciate it. You understand the void the way we never have, instinctively, emotionally, spiritually. Your species looks at the space between stars and sees presence. Ours looks at it and sees challenge. We've always been that way. It's not a virtue, it's a neurology. And it's why the builders were right to be afraid of us, even if they were wrong about everything else. Chen shifted slightly, a subtle movement that drew attention back to him without demanding it, a skill that Telvek recognized and admired because it was exactly the kind of nonverbal command presence that Velthari officers spent decades cultivating. Commander, I'd like to invite you and your senior officers aboard the Prometheus for the full briefing. The data sets are too large for transmission, and some of what we need to show you requires direct observation. Dr. Hale will remain aboard your ship as our liaison, shall we say, to answer any questions your crew might have and to ensure that the cultural exchange goes smoothly. The Prometheus, so the central structure had a name. Of course it did. Humans named things. Telvek had learned that from the archaeological fragments, from the way human designations for ships and places and concepts always carried a weight of meaning that Velthari alphanumeric cataloging lacked. Prometheus. He did not know the reference, but the word itself, the way it sounded in human phonology, the way Hale's translation rendered it into Velthari as something like the one who steals fire ahead of need, suggested a being who took what was not offered and bore the consequences. An appropriate name for a ship with a star inside it. Agreed, Telvek said. I will bring Lieutenant Orak, my navigation chief, and Sub-Lieutenant Vesara will remain aboard with Dr. Hale. He paused and a thought occurred to him, a small thing, another detail that most people would not have noticed, but that seemed important in a way he could not fully articulate. And Chief Engineer Gareth, if he is awake. He is, Vesara said quietly. He asked me to tell you that if you left him behind, he would personally pilot a shuttle to the Prometheus using nothing but dead reckoning and spite. Telvek allowed himself a moment of something that was not quite amusement but occupied the same neighborhood. Then Gareth comes. The shuttle ride to the Prometheus took 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which Telvek sat in a human spacecraft for the first time in his life, surrounded by human technology, breathing human recycled air that tasted faintly of something he could not identify, minerals perhaps, or a trace element in the environmental systems that had no Velthari equivalent, and trying to process the sensory overload of an environment designed for a species whose perceptions were fundamentally different from his own. The shuttle's interior was not uncomfortable. That surprised him. He had expected alienness, the wrong proportions, the wrong textures, the wrong everything, and the alienness was there, but it was muted, softened by the same thoughtfulness that had adjusted the shuttle's external lighting. The seats were contoured in a way that accommodated Velthari physiology despite being designed for human bodies. Someone had modified them recently, with padding that conformed to his digitigrade legs and a backrest that supported his crest without pressing against its serrations. The air temperature was slightly warmer than human standard, closer to Velthari comfort zones. Even the subtle vibration of the shuttle's drive, a frequency that was clearly tuned for human perception, had been dampened to a level that Tailvek's more sensitive hearing could tolerate without discomfort. These were not the actions of a species that saw other beings as threats to be neutralized. These were the actions of a species that saw other beings as problems to be solved, and solved them thoroughly, efficiently, with the same methodical precision they applied to everything else. Chen sat across from Tailvek, his uniformed companion Okonkwo beside him. Oryx sat to Tailvek's left, his blunt, stocky body jammed into a modified seat that was clearly too narrow for his deepwater variant frame, his neck crest flushed darker than usual, his small eyes taking in everything with the flat, unreadable expression of a navigator who was memorizing every detail of the route for the return trip. Gareth sat to Tailvek's right, and the old engineer was leaning forward in his seat with an expression of barely contained excitement, his worn crest raised to its maximum, his eyes fixed on the shuttle's interior surfaces with the intensity of someone committing every detail to memory. "I have questions," Tailvek said during the fourth minute of silence. "I expected you would," Chen replied. "The linguistic data, your standard Velthari is too good for passive observation. Even 400 years of monitoring communications traffic would not give you the nuance I'm hearing from you and Dr. Hale." "How?" Chen glanced at Okonkwo, who produced a thin tablet device from a pocket and handed it to him. He tapped the surface, studied something for a moment, then handed it to Tailvek. The tablet displayed a list. Names, dates, designations, hundreds of them spanning a period of approximately 200 years. Each entry had a status marker. Most were green, a few were yellow, one was red. Tailvek scanned the list and felt his crests rise as he understood what he was reading. "Agents," he said. "You placed agents in Velthari space." "Observers," Chen corrected, "non-interference protocols. They lived among your people disguised when necessary, though the technology for that is imperfect and we preferred cultural integration where possible. They learned your languages by speaking them. They learned your customs by practicing them. Some of them raised families among you. Some of them died among you. They were our eyes and ears, yes, but they were also our teachers. Every piece of cultural data they sent back was studied, analyzed, incorporated into our understanding of who you are as a species." He paused and something moved in his expression, not quite regret, not quite pride, but something in between. "When I speak your language, Commander, I am speaking the language that your people taught my people. One conversation at a time, over 200 years of careful, patient, deeply respectful engagement." The weight of that settled over Tailvek like a second skin. 200 years. While the Velthari Senate had been debating the existence of humans, while the Science Directorate had been dismissing the archaeological evidence as myth, while the military had been filing reports about the barrier that no one read, humans had been living among them, walking their streets, speaking their language, raising children in their cities. And no one, not the intelligence services, not the border security apparatus, not the most paranoid faction in the Senate, had noticed. Because the humans had not wanted to be noticed. Because they were good at not being noticed. Because a species that could build a structure around a star could certainly build a disguise good enough to fool Velthari border scanners. "The red entry," Tailvek said, handing the tablet back. "What does red mean?" Chen's expression did not change. "It means they were discovered. Approximately 40 years ago, one of our observers was identified by a Velthari counterintelligence operation. They were detained, questioned, and ultimately," another pause, and this one was heavier, weighted with something that Chen was choosing not to name, "removed from Velthari space. We don't know what happened to them after that." "We have no record of such an incident," Oryx said, speaking for the first time since boarding the shuttle. His deepwater accent was thick, the consonants rounded, and the vowels flattened in ways that made even standard Velthari sound like a regional dialect. "We know," Chen said, "the operation was classified above the level that your observers would have access to. But it happened. We have our own sources." The implication hung in the recycled air of the shuttle like smoke. The Velthari had caught a human agent, had interrogated them, had removed them, and then had buried the incident so deeply that even a commander on a mission to investigate human activity beyond the veil had not been told about it. Which meant that someone in the Unity government, someone senior, someone with access to the highest levels of classified intelligence, had known that humans were real, that they were active, that they had penetrated Velthari space, and had chosen to suppress that information while simultaneously authorizing a reconnaissance mission that was designed to find exactly what that someone already knew was there. Telvek filed that thought away. It was a problem for later, a political problem, a betrayal problem, a problem that would need to be dealt with when he returned to Unity Space, assuming he returned to Unity Space, assuming any of them returned anywhere. For now, there was a more immediate problem. The shuttle was decelerating, and through the small viewport beside his seat, Telvek could see the Prometheus. Up close, the structure was even more overwhelming than it had appeared from a distance. The surface that had seemed smooth from the Resolute Judgment's viewport was revealed to be a complex mosaic of panels and plates and access hatches, each one slightly different in color and texture from its neighbors, the cumulative effect being something that looked less like a constructed object and more like a grown one, a living thing that had accumulated its surface over time, adding and shedding and reshaping in response to changing needs. Lights blinked in patterns that might have been navigation signals or might have been something else entirely. Openings in the hull, some of them large enough to fly the shuttle through, others barely visible, pulsed with the blue-white glow of internal activity. And through it all, visible in gaps between panels, in the spaces between structures, in the cracks and seams of the vast construction was light. Not artificial light, the warm, golden light of stellar fusion, filtered and diffused by layers of containment technology but unmistakably, unambiguously starlight. The star at the center of the Prometheus was not hidden. It was not sealed away behind layers of shielding. It was present, its light woven through the structure like blood through tissue, a constant, visible reminder of what this species had accomplished. They had taken a star, the fundamental engine of creation, the object around which planets formed and life evolved and civilizations rose, the thing that every sentient species in the galaxy looked to as the source of warmth and light and existence, and they had put it inside their ship. Gareth made a sound, a low, keening, reverent sound that vibrated in his chest and resonated through the shuttle's frame. Telvek looked at the old engineer and saw that his eyes were wet again, and his crest was raised to its absolute maximum, and his whole body was trembling with an emotion that was too large, too complex, too mixed to be classified as any single thing. It was awe, it was fear. It was joy and sorrow and pride and humility, and a dozen other things that the Velthari language had words for but that Telvek could not sort through because they were all happening at once. "I knew," Gareth whispered, "I knew." The shuttle entered the Prometheus through an opening that was large enough to accommodate a vessel 10 times its size, passing through a transition zone where the golden starlight mixed with the blue-white of human artificial illumination, creating a luminous haze that made the interior of the structure look like the inside of a sunrise. They descended through layers of structure, decks and compartments and corridors that flashed past the viewport in a blur of activity, human figures moving through spaces designed for human proportions, the whole vast interior humming with the focused energy of a civilization at war with its own past. They landed, the hatch opened, and Telvek stepped onto the Prometheus and into the light of a star that humans had tamed and felt the warmth of it on his violet skin and understood, finally, completely, irrevocably, that the galaxy he had known was gone and a new one was being born and that he was standing at the place where the birth was happening. The briefing room was not what Telvek expected. He had expected a military facility, functional, austere, designed for the efficient transmission of information from commanders to subordinates. What he found was something closer to a theater, a large, curved space with tiered seating arranged in a semicircle around a central presentation area, the walls covered in displays that showed real-time data from across the Armada. The seating was not designed for humans alone. Velthari-scale chairs had been added, clearly recently, their organic curves looking slightly incongruous amid the angular human architecture. The lighting was adjustable, currently set to a warm golden tone that was almost certainly derived from the star at the structure's center. The thoughtfulness again, the persistent, thorough, almost obsessive thoughtfulness. Every point of contact between human and Velthari, every interface and environment and sensory experience had been anticipated and adjusted. It was not accommodation in the diplomatic sense, not the grudging concessions that the Unity made when dealing with species whose needs differed from their own. It was something deeper. Something that approached empathy, the ability to imagine another being's experience and to modify one's own behavior to reduce their discomfort, not because it was required, but because it was right. Telvek sat, Oryx sat beside him, his massive frame dwarfing the Velthari-scale chair. Gareth sat on Telvek's other side, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the central presentation area with the intensity of a student who has waited his entire life for this class. Chen stood at the center. Okonkwo stood beside him, the data unit under her arm. Behind them, the largest display in the room activated, showing the star chart that Tailvek had seen during their first communication, the Milky Way, the monitoring stations, the convergence point in intergalactic space. 3 hours, Chen said. That's how long I have to give you the complete picture. After that, the Armada begins its final approach maneuvers and I need to be on the command deck. So I'm going to be direct, no diplomacy, no careful phrasing, just the truth as we understand it in the plainest terms available. He looked at Tailvik. Can you handle that? I have spent the last 3 hours inside a human spacecraft approaching a structure that contains a star admiral. My capacity for handling has been significantly recalibrated. Something flickered across Chen's face, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. Good, then let's begin. He began with the builders. Not the version of the builders that Velthari archaeology had constructed, the wise precursors, the benevolent ancestors, the mysterious elders whose ruins dotted the galaxy like monuments to a superior wisdom. The real builders, a species that had dominated the Milky Way for approximately 50,000 years, which was long enough to reshape entire stellar systems, but not long enough to outgrow the paranoia that had driven them from the start. They had been afraid of everything, of entropy, of extinction, of the unpredictable emergent properties of less advanced civilizations. Their entire technological trajectory had been oriented toward control. Control of their environment, control of their biology, control of the developmental pathways of every species they encountered. The quarantine was not an anomaly. It was the logical endpoint of builder philosophy. When they had discovered humanity, a pre-spaceflight species on a small rocky world orbiting an unremarkable yellow dwarf, they had not seen a potential ally or a future trading partner or even a curiosity to be studied. They had seen a variable, an uncertainty, a factor that their predictive models could not account for. Humans were aggressive in a way that the builders' models said they should not be, given their evolutionary history and environmental conditions. They were adaptable in ways that violated the builders' assumptions about the relationship between biology and cultural development. They were innovative, not merely capable of copying existing technologies, but of generating genuinely new solutions to problems, solutions that the builders' models had not predicted and could not explain. The builders had run their models. The models had said, this species will exceed you within 10,000 years if left unchecked. The builders had looked at that result and had made a choice. Not extermination, Chen emphasized this, his voice hardening with an anger that 3 centuries had not diminished, because extermination was messy and left evidence and the builders were, above all else, creatures of cleanliness and order. Erasure, the removal of humanity from the historical record. The sealing of Sol behind a barrier that would prevent any other species from finding them. And the creation of a cleanup protocol, a dormant automated weapon system buried in the intergalactic void that would activate if the quarantine ever failed. The builders didn't just try to erase us, Chen said. They tried to erase the idea of us. Every database they could access, every archive they could reach, every record that mentioned humanity in any context, they scrubbed it, left behind enough fragmentary references to maintain the internal consistency of their own historical records, but not enough for any other species to reconstruct what had been removed. It was, he paused, searching for a word, surgical. The most thorough act of historical vandalism in the history of this galaxy. And yet you survived, Tailvik said. We survived because they missed something. Chen tapped the display and the star chart was replaced by an image, a ruin unmistakably builder in design but damaged, crumbling, half-buried in the surface of what looked like a dead moon. A maintenance station, automated, running on minimal power for 80,000 years. Its primary databases had been wiped, but its backup systems, the ones the builders didn't know about because they were installed by a junior maintenance engineer who was more careful than his superiors, still contained a compressed archive of builder records from the period when the quarantine was established, including a complete species profile on humanity. A junior maintenance engineer, Gareth said, and his voice was rough with something that sounded like laughter and grief and vindication all tangled together. Your entire civilization was saved by a junior maintenance engineer. The universe has a sense of humor, Chen said dryly. We don't find it funny. The briefing continued. Chen walked them through the 3,000 years of human history since the rediscovery of the Builder Archive, the slow, painful process of reconstructing a lost identity from fragmentary data, the centuries of technological development driven by a single, overriding purpose, the discovery of Builder ruins within the quarantine zone that had provided the raw materials for humanity's technological revolution. The decision, made approximately 300 years ago, to prepare not just for survival but for victory. The Armada was the result. 40,000 ships, now confirmed to be approximately 40% of humanity's total military capacity, with the remaining 60% still in Sol system, completing preparations for what Chen called the second wave. Each ship was designed for a specific role in the tactical framework that humanity had developed to counter builder technology. The screening elements at the perimeter were disposable, cheap to build, cheap to lose, intended to absorb the first wave of the cleanup force's attack and provide data on its capabilities. The second layer contained the main combatants, more expensive, more capable, designed to exploit the vulnerabilities that the screening elements identified. The third layer was the command and control infrastructure. The flagships, the communications relays, the coordination nodes that would direct the fleet's response in real time. And at the center was the Prometheus, not merely a flagship but a factory, a mobile construction facility capable of building new ships from raw materials harvested from asteroids and gas giants, powered by the star at its core, capable of sustaining the Armada indefinitely in deep space without reliance on supply lines. The Prometheus was humanity's answer to the fundamental problem of fighting a war in the intergalactic void, logistics. With the Prometheus, the Armada could fight forever. Without it, they would run out of ammunition and fuel and spare parts within months. The cleanup force is coming from beyond the galactic edge, Okonkwo said, taking over the briefing with a brisk, efficient manner that contrasted sharply with Chen's measured intensity. We estimate it will arrive in the galactic rim in approximately 60 to 120 years. We don't know its exact composition, but based on the energy signatures of the monitoring station's activation signal, we believe it consists of automated warships built to builder specifications. Probably millions of individual units, possibly more. Millions, Orak repeated, and his deep-water accent made the word sound like a curse. Millions of automated units, yes, but automated means predictable. They follow programmed parameters, they adapt within defined limits, they do not innovate. Okonkwo's voice carried the confidence of someone who had spent years studying an opponent and had arrived at conclusions she was prepared to defend. Humanity's entire tactical doctrine for this engagement is based on that limitation. We don't need to be stronger than the cleanup force. We need to be more adaptable, more creative. More willing to try things that the builder's programming cannot anticipate. That, Gareth said, speaking for the first time since entering the briefing room, is the most terrifying thing anyone has ever said to me, and I have been told I was going to die 3 times. Okonkwo looked at him. Why terrifying? Because it means you're not planning to win by being bigger or stronger or more advanced. You're planning to win by being human. And I have spent the last 3 hours learning what that means, and it means things that no other species in this galaxy can do. The briefing room was silent. Okonkwo stared at Gareth for a long moment, her expression unreadable, and then she nodded, a single sharp human gesture that carried in that context the weight of acknowledgement and respect. Yes, she said, exactly. The 3 hours ended. Chen left for the command deck, his uniformed form disappearing through a doorway that sealed behind him with a hiss of pressurized air. And Tailvek was left standing in the briefing room with Orak and Gareth and the vast, humming, starlit reality of the Prometheus surrounding them on all sides. They did not speak for a long time. The displays on the walls showed the Armada in real time, the vast formation of ships beginning its final approach maneuvers, the delicate, complex choreography of 40,000 vessels adjusting their positions with a precision that bordered on the organic. Tailvek watched the display and thought about what he had learned, and the thoughts were large and slow and difficult to hold, like trying to carry water in open hands. The builders were coming back. The cleanup protocol was real. The threat that the precursors had designed to handle the consequences of their own paranoia was active, inbound, and numbered in the millions. In 60 to 120 years, it would arrive at the galactic rim, and it would begin its work not just against humanity but against everything. Because the cleanup protocol, according to Chen's analysis, was not targeted specifically at humans. It was targeted at instability, at any species that had developed beyond the parameters the builders had deemed acceptable. The quarantine was the trigger, but the cleanup was the weapon, and once activated, it would not stop at the quarantine's edge. Every spacefaring species in the galaxy was a target. The Velthari, the Thraxis, the Keithrani, all of them. Every civilization that had risen in the 80,000 years since the builders left, every culture, every achievement, every individual life, was marked for destruction by a weapon built by cowards who had fled rather than face the consequences of their own fear. And the only force in the galaxy that had known about this, that had prepared for this, that had spent 3 centuries building the means to fight it, was a species that the rest of the galaxy had agreed was a myth. Commander, Orak's voice deep and unhurried, the voice of a navigator who had found his course and was following it without hesitation. We need to go back. Tailvek turned. Go back. To the Unity with this information. Not through official channels, the channels that suppressed the discovery of a human agent 40 years ago. Directly, to every world, every station, every species that will listen. What we carry now is not military intelligence. It is the most important information in the history of this galaxy. His blunt, practical face was set in an expression that Tailvek had never seen on it before, not determination, not resolve, but something that lived in the neighborhood of both and exceeded them. The humans cannot fight this alone. They are strong, stronger than anything I have ever seen or imagined. But millions of automated warships is millions of automated warships. Even adaptability has limits. Even creativity runs out of ideas eventually. They need allies. They need us, all of us. Us, Gareth echoed, and his ancient voice carried a weight that made the word sound like a foundation stone being laid. The Velthari, who have never fought a peer war, who have spent 8 centuries building trade routes while the humans spent 3 centuries building armadas. What use could we possibly be to them? The same use that the junior maintenance engineer was, Orek said simply. The thing that no one expects, the variable in the equation, the small thing that changes everything. He paused, and something moved behind his small, deep-set eyes, the look of a navigator who has found a route that no one else can see. The humans are adaptable, Captain said, more adaptable than the cleanup force, but they have been adapting alone for 3,000 years. They have been inside a self-imposed box, a box of their own making, where they have been so focused on preparing for this one fight that they could not develop perspectives that come from outside their experience. We are outside their experience, Commander. We see things they don't see. We think in ways they don't think. That is not weakness. That is value. Tailvek looked at Orek, looked at Gareth, looked at the displays on the walls, the Armada, the starlight, the vast and terrifying and magnificent reality of what humanity had built in the darkness of their quarantine. He thought about the stories, the fragmentary archives, the scholars who said humans were myths, the Senate that had sent him here expecting him to fail, the unnamed someone who had buried the truth about a human agent because the truth was inconvenient. He thought about Vesara standing on the bridge of the resolute judgment, her young crest raised, her voice steady, her fear transformed into something that was not courage but its precursor. The thing that comes before courage, the raw material that courage is made of, the willingness to act despite not knowing what will happen. He thought about Chen's face when Tailvek had said he was not going back. That flicker in the eyes, respect, possibly tinged with ruefulness. The expression of someone who had been hopping for exactly that answer but had not allowed himself to expect it. He thought about Ezra Hale, standing in the cargo bay of a Velthari ship, looking at Velthari walls with Velthari wonder, loving Velthari poetry, speaking Velthari better than most Velthari and understanding, truly understanding, that the space between stars was a living presence. I am not going to carry this information back through channels, Tailvek said. I am going to carry it back through space, all 12 ships, every member of this crew, every byte of data the humans are willing to share, and I am not going to stop at the Unity. He turned to the display, to the star chart, to the red markers that represented builder monitoring stations scattered across the entire galaxy. Every one of those stations has been watching, recording, measuring. Every species that has arisen in this galaxy is in those databases. The humans have had 400 years to study the data. They know who's out there, they know where to find them, they know how to talk to them. He paused and felt the something that had cracked inside him on the Resolute Judgment's bridge, the something that had finished cracking in the corridor of ships and been reborn as clarity settle into its final form. We are not going to ask the Unity for permission. We are going to ask the galaxy for help. Gareth laughed. That same high, sharp, slightly hysterical laugh that Tailvek had produced earlier, but richer, deeper, informed by 80 years of life and 40 years of deep space experience, and the accumulated weight of every time he had been told he was wrong about the void and every time he had known he was right. The legends were real, Gareth said, and his voice broke on the last word and the tears ran freely down his faded lavender skin, and his crest was raised to its maximum, and he was crying and laughing and trembling all at once, and he was the most human thing Tailvek had ever seen. They were real and they're here and they're going to save us all and no one is going to believe us. Then we make them believe, Tailvek said. That is what witnesses do. They left the Prometheus 3 hours later. Chen met them at the shuttle bay briefly, formally, with the curt efficiency of a commander who had maneuvering calculations to oversee and could not linger in pleasantries. But in that brief encounter, something passed between Tailvek and the human admiral that was not verbal and not physical, and not any form of communication that either species had formally codified. It was a handshake without hands. An acknowledgement between two beings who understood in that moment that they were standing at the beginning of something that would outlast both of them. That the decisions made in this shuttle bay, on this day, in this place that should not exist, would ripple outward through the galaxy for centuries to come. 72 hours, Chen said. That's how long before the Armada reaches the point where our slip drives need to engage for the jump to the contact zone. If you're going back to Velthari space to rally support, you need to leave now. We're leaving now, Tailvek said. Chen nodded. Then unexpectedly, he extended his hand, the human gesture that Tailvik had seen in the archaeological texts, the offering of an open palm, the physical expression of trust and equality. Tailvik looked at the hand for a moment. It was smaller than his own, the fingers shorter and thicker, the skin a warm brown that contrasted sharply with his own pale violet. There were scars on the knuckles, old scars faded to white, the marks of a life that included physical violence in ways that Velthari civilization had long since abandoned. Tailvik reached out and grasped the hand. The human grip was firm, stronger than Tailvik had expected, the fingers closing around his with a pressure that was controlled but unmistakable, the grip of a species that had not forgotten how to hold on to things. "When you come back," Chen said quietly, "bring friends." The shuttle carried them back through the corridor of ships, 32 minutes this time, because Orek plotted a faster return route, his deepwater navigator's instincts finding the most efficient path through the Armada's formation with an ease that bordered on intuition. The resolute judgment was waiting at the anchorage point, its Velthari hull a soft organic curve amid the angular human warships, and as the shuttle approached, Tailvik could see Vesara on the bridge through the viewport, her young silhouette sharp against the bioluminescent glow, her crest raised. Ezra Hale was standing beside her. The old human was pointing at something on Vesara's console, a communication waveform, Tailvik guessed, or perhaps a linguistic analysis. And Vesara was leaning in, her body language open and engaged, the tension of the past hours softened into something that looked almost like collaboration. As Tailvik watched, Hale said something, and Vesara's crest flickered in what was unmistakably amusement. And Hale laughed, a warm, genuine, delighted laugh that Tailvik could hear faintly through the shuttle's hull as they approached. And in that moment, framed by the viewport like a painting, the human and the Velthari standing side by side on a bridge that had been designed for neither of them, Tailvik saw the future. Not the war, not the cleanup force, not the millions of automated warships that were even now crossing the intergalactic void toward a galaxy that did not know it was under sentence of death. Those things were real and terrible and they would need to be faced, but they were not the future. They were the test, the crucible in which the future would be forged. The future was this: two species so different that they could not have designed each other if they had tried, finding common ground in the space between stars, sharing knowledge, sharing wonder, sharing poetry and starlight and the particular kind of laughter that comes from realizing that the universe is stranger and more beautiful and more dangerous than anyone imagined. The future was a human who loved Velthari poetry, standing on a Velthari bridge, making a Velthari officer laugh. The future was this. The shuttle docked, the hatch opened. Tailvik stepped onto his own ship, his own deck, his own walls, his own soft blue-white light and felt for the first time since crossing the veil that he was home. Not because the resolute judgment was safe, it was not safe, nothing was safe, the galaxy was about to discover that it had been living in a fool's paradise for 80,000 years, but because home was not a place, home was a purpose. Home was the thing you were fighting for, and Tailvik now knew, with a certainty that burned in his chest like the star at the center of the Prometheus, what he was fighting for. He was fighting for the right of every species in this galaxy to look up at the stars and see wonder instead of fear. He was fighting for the poets and the navigators and the old engineers who believed in things that no one else believed. He was fighting for Vesara's laugh and Gareth's tears and Orak's quiet, practical courage. He was fighting for a future in which the void between stars was not a barrier or a weapon or a tomb, but a highway. A road that connected every species that had ever looked up and wondered what was out there. He was fighting alongside humans. The legends were real, and they were going to save everything. "All hands," Tailvik said, his voice carrying through every corridor and compartment and crevice of the resolute judgment, his crests raised to their full extension, his hearts beating in perfect synchronized rhythm, his body straight and his mind clear and his purpose burning like a star. "This is Commander Tailvik. Set course for Velthari space. Maximum speed, all slip drives to full power." He paused, and in the pause he felt the weight of every story, every fragment, every whisper about the species that the precursors had feared enough to quarantine an entire region of space. "We have a galaxy to wake up." The resolute judgment turned. Its 11 sister ships followed. The human armada opened a corridor in its formation, not the same corridor they had entered through, but a new one freshly calculated, leading outward toward the veil barrier, toward Velthari space, toward the galaxy that was waiting to learn that its oldest story was true. Through the viewport, the armada stretched on and on, dark silhouettes against the stars, engines burning steady and blue, an endless wall of vessels built by a species that the galaxy had forgotten. The light of the Prometheus's star followed them as they departed, a golden glow that faded slowly as distance accumulated, but that never quite disappeared, a warm point of light in the darkness that was visible long after the structure itself had been lost to sight. A beacon, a reminder, a promise. The legends were real. And they were coming.